Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where big stories are given a little room to breathe. Tonight, we're settling in with one of those ideas that sounds almost absurd when you first hear it. Human beings, people who looked very much like us, have been around for roughly 250,000 years, and yet for nearly all of that time, there were no cities, no books, no engines, no universities, no stock markets, no late-night food delivery, which depending on your priorities may be the most shocking part of all. For tens of thousands of generations, life moved at a pace so slow that from a modern distance it can look like almost nothing was happening. Then, somewhere along the line, everything began to speed up. Villages became towns, towns became cities, knowledge started to pile up instead of vanishing with the people who carried it, tools became systems, systems became civilizations, and eventually here we are, glowing quietly in the dark beside screens, asking how on earth it all changed so fast. Before we get into that, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, or this morning, or perhaps at some strange in-between hour when the rest of the house is asleep, and you've decided that learning about prehistory is the ideal way to unwind. And while you're there, what time is it where you are? It feels oddly appropriate for a story like this because human history is really a story about different clocks. There is the clock of a single day, which tells you when to eat and when to sleep. There is the clock of a human life, which feels long while you're living it and alarmingly brief when you look back. And then there is the great slow clock of our species, which ticked almost imperceptibly for a very long time before it seemed, rather suddenly, to begin racing. If this sort of long, thoughtful wandering through science and history is your kind of thing, do consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps this little corner of calm and curiosity find more people who enjoy ending the day with a question large enough to make their laundry, inbox, or tomorrow's alarm seem just a little less dramatic. Not unimportant, of course, just temporarily placed in perspective by 250,000 years of human existence. Now, the title of this story is deliberately provocative. For 250,000 years, humans did nothing. Then, everything changed. And immediately, of course, we should admit that this is not literally true. Humans were not doing nothing. Far from it. They were doing the most important and difficult thing any creature can do. They were staying alive. They were surviving ice ages, droughts, predators, disease, injury, childbirth, hunger, and each other. They were raising children without hospitals, building lives without permanent shelter, making meaning without books, and solving practical problems with only what their minds, hands, and communities could hold. They were watching animals, memorizing landscapes, shaping stone, tending fires, reading seasons, negotiating alliances, grieving the dead, telling stories, and learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, how to be human together. So the real question is not why humans spent most of their existence doing nothing. The real question is why progress, at least the kind we usually notice from textbooks and skylines, was so slow for so long. Why did anatomically modern humans appear so early, while agriculture, writing, states, metallurgy, and machines came so much later? Why did the species remain for ages in small groups, living by hunting, gathering, sharing, arguing, adapting, and moving on, before all the familiar machinery of civilization began to gather pace? And perhaps most interesting of all, why did things not just change, but accelerate, as though history had finally found a downhill slope? A helpful place to start is with a simple correction to our instincts. We tend to imagine the past badly because our minds are drawn to visible change. If a society leaves behind monuments, roads, books, and ruins, we feel it has done something. If it leaves behind only campsites, stone flakes, beads, bones, traces of pigment, and scattered footprints in ancient mud, we are tempted to imagine silence, stillness, emptiness. But that is an illusion created by preservation. The archaeological record is not a fair diary. It is a patchy, often rude editor. Wood rots, leather disappears, Plant fibres vanish. Songs leave no fossils. Conversations do not survive. Rituals evaporate. The delicate structure of a social world, its customs, taboos, jokes, obligations, and tiny everyday acts of care rarely makes it into the ground in a way we can recover. Which means that when we look back at early humans and see only a handful of tools, we may be mistaking poor evidence for poor lives. Think of it this way. If some future archaeologist were to excavate your home after everything soft, digital, and perishable had been erased, what would they conclude about you? They might find fragments of ceramic, a few metal objects, maybe some glass, perhaps a spoon stubbornly refusing to decay. They would not find your favourite music, your mother's advice, the odd little phrase your friends use, the way you know which floorboard creaks, the recipe you make from memory, or the fact that you once spent 40 minutes looking for your phone while holding it in your hand. Most of being human does not fossilise well. Early humans were already intelligent in ways that matter enormously. They had language, or something close enough to language to coordinate, teach, warn, persuade, and remember. They had social rules. They had emotional lives. They made choices under pressure. They adapted to different climates and landscapes. They used tools not just by instinct, but by learning. They passed techniques from person to person. They likely gossiped, which, though not often celebrated in grand narratives, is one of the most efficient technologies ever invented for tracking trust, reputation, conflict, and alliance in a small group. They probably also had people who talked too much around the fire, because some features of the human condition appear to be absolutely timeless. Yet intelligence alone does not guarantee rapid progress. This is one of the most important things to understand. A clever species can remain materially stable for immense spans of time if its environment is harsh, its numbers are low, and its knowledge is fragile. And for most of human existence, all three were true. Life in hunter-gatherer bands was demanding in a way that is difficult for many modern people to feel in their bones. Food had to be found, not bought. Water had to be located and remembered. Shelter had to be built or improvised. Weather was not an inconvenience, but a direct force in your survival. An infection from a cut, a failed hunt, a bad winter, a dry season, an injury to the wrong person at the wrong time. Any of these could tilt a group toward disaster. Under such conditions, you do innovate, but you innovate mostly for survival. You improve a spear point, not because you're laying the foundation for metallurgy 3,000 generations later, but because missing the animal may mean your children do not eat. You learn the route of migrating herds, not because you are building a transportation network, but because getting it wrong could kill you. You remember which plants heal and which poison, which rivers flood, which caves stay dry, which strangers can be approached and which avoided. It is sophisticated knowledge. It is simply not the kind that usually becomes a monument. There is another difficulty. Small populations do not just invent less often, they also forget more easily. This is crucial. Knowledge is not like firewood sitting in a pile waiting for anyone to use it. It lives inside people, inside habits, inside communities, inside repeated practice. If only a few individuals know how to make a certain tool, weave a certain fibre, prepare a certain poison, or navigate a certain route, then the death of those individuals can erase the technique entirely. One epidemic, one storm, one conflict, one unlucky season, and a whole line of hard-won understanding can disappear. In a world of tiny scattered groups, culture does not accumulate smoothly. It flickers. It advances in one place and vanishes in another. It survives here, gets lost there, reappears somewhere else in altered form. Progress is not a staircase. It is more like trying to build a library in the rain with most of the books written on leaves. And population size matters for another reason as well. More people means more minds, certainly, but also more interactions between minds. Ideas do not usually become transformative the moment they are born. They become transformative when they meet other ideas, when someone improves them, recombines them, spreads them, teaches them, or applies them in a new context. A single invention in an isolated group may remain local, temporary, or even useless beyond its original need. But the same invention in a larger, denser, more connected population has better odds of surviving long enough to be improved. It can travel. It can be copied. Someone can specialize in it. Someone else can trade for it. Another person can make a better version. This is one of the quiet motors of history. Density does not merely multiply people, it multiplies possibilities. For most of the time, anatomically, modern humans have existed, however, density was low. Very low. The world was not full of us in the way it feels now. There were long stretches of land with no one there at all. Groups could go generations without meeting many outsiders. A community might contain only a few dozen people. Even wider networks where they existed were thin and vulnerable. That means every cultural gain had a harder life. Every piece of knowledge had fewer carriers, fewer teachers, fewer apprentices, fewer opportunities to be combined with something else. Human brilliance was present, but it was distributed sparsely across enormous landscapes. Then there is the matter of movement. For hunter-gatherers, mobility was often an advantage. If resources were seasonal, moving made sense. If game shifted, you shifted. If a region became difficult, you left. This flexibility was not primitive incompetence. It was often a smart adaptation. Settling permanently in one place without reliable food storage and predictable local resources would have been reckless. But mobility changes what kinds of complexity are worth building. If you carry your world with you, you do not construct great quantities of heavy infrastructure. You develop skills, memories, and portable tools. Your sophistication is embedded in people more than in permanent things, and once again, that means much of it is harder for later ages to notice and easier for shocks to erase. This is why the phrase "everything changed" can be misleading if we imagine a sudden awakening. There was no morning on which humans rubbed their eyes, looked around and said, "Right, enough of this, let's invent civilization." What happened instead was something slower, stranger, and more interesting. Tiny improvements accumulated unevenly over vast spans of time. Better tools, better control of fire, better communication, better social learning, better adaptation to specific landscapes, symbolic thought becoming richer, more visible, more transferable. Exchange networks extending a little further, rituals strengthening group identity, storytelling carrying practical knowledge and moral rules together. None of these by themselves flips the switch, but together, over absurdly long periods, they change what a human group can retain, coordinate, and attempt. Fire alone is a good example. To us it can seem so ordinary that we barely notice how revolutionary it is. Controlled fire changes diet, safety, warmth, social life, and time itself. It allows cooking, which makes more foods digestible and calories easier to extract. It extends the usable day into the dark. It offers protection from predators. It creates a place to gather, teach, repair, plan, gossip, flirt, argue, and tell stories. You could make a serious case that the evening conversation around fire was one of the great institutions of human prehistory. Not an institution with paperwork, naturally. More one with smoke, memory, and at least one person insisting they definitely saw the animal first. Language, too, transformed the speed at which culture could move, even if we cannot place a neat date on its maturity. Once knowledge can be described, corrected, rehearsed, and elaborated in words, learning becomes far more efficient. You do not need everyone to rediscover everything by trial and error. You can warn children away from danger they have never seen. You can explain why a hunt failed. You can coordinate larger groups. You can preserve stories that encode geography, seasons, ancestors, obligations, and techniques. You can imagine collectively. An imagination is not a decorative extra. It is a practical technology. It allows humans to cooperate around things that do not physically exist in the present moment. Promises, taboos, shared identities, future plans, gods, rules, debts, kinship systems, territories, and eventually states. Before any society can become large and complex, it must be able to believe in things together. This is part of why the long prehistory of our species should not be seen as wasted time before the real story began. It was the real story. It was the period in which the human mind, the human social world, and the human toolkit were being tested across wildly different conditions. People moved through deserts, coastlines, forests, mountains, grasslands, and frozen worlds. They learned to live in them, not perfectly, but well enough to endure. They experimented, failed, remembered, forgot, retried, borrowed, adapted, and passed on what they could. Progress was slow, not because humans lacked intelligence, but because the world they lived in imposed severe limits on storage, scale, and continuity. And continuity, perhaps more than genius, is what eventually changes history. Once knowledge can survive the death of individuals more reliably, it starts to stack. Once groups become larger and more settled, specialization becomes possible. Once food can be produced in more predictable surplus, not everywhere and not instantly, some people can spend less time acquiring calories and more time doing other things, making pottery, observing seasons, building structures, organizing labor, tracking goods, remembering lineages, formalizing rituals, and eventually keeping records. Once records exist, memory escapes the skull. Once memory escapes the skull, culture can grow in ways no purely oral society can easily match. Not better in every sense, but faster in cumulative complexity. That acceleration is still ahead of us in this story. For now, it is enough to notice that the apparent stillness of most human existence was not stillness at all. It was groundwork, not deliberate groundwork in the sense that early foragers were knowingly preparing the conditions for writing, cities, or science thousands of generations later. But groundwork all the same, the long beginning, the phase in which our species learned how to survive long enough, connect widely enough, remember securely enough, and trust collectively enough for later changes to take hold. From where we sit now, the past can seem badly paced. We are used to fast updates, fast transport, fast communication, fast disappointment when the page takes more than 3 seconds to load. We instinctively expect change to announce itself, but the larger portion of human history did not move like that. It moved like roots spreading underground, quietly, unevenly, easy to miss until one day the surface looks different and you realize the work had been going on all along. And once you start looking at the deep past in that way, the question shifts. It is no longer, why were humans doing nothing? It becomes, what exactly were they building invisibly for so very long? And that is where we begin to meet them not as failed moderns waiting for civilization to arrive, but as fully human people already carrying the minds, fears, skills, and social instincts that would one day make the world change speed. To see that clearly, it helps to meet those early humans a little more honestly. Not as crude prototypes waiting for civilization to switch them on, and not as half-finished versions of us standing around in animal skins wondering what a wheel might be. They were already human. Not symbolically human, not almost human. Not human if you squint. Human in the full biological sense, and in many important ways human in the emotional and social sense too. If one of those people from 100,000 or 200,000 years ago could somehow be brought forward in time as a newborn and raised in a modern family, there is every reason to think that child could learn a language, go to school, develop a sense of humour, become anxious at 2 a.m. for no clear reason, and probably ignore useful advice from their parents with exactly the same confidence modern children have always managed to produce. That is one of the strangest parts of the whole story. The bodies arrived long before the world we associate with people like us. Anatomically, modern humans emerged roughly 300,000 years ago in Africa, give or take the usual archaeological arguments, which are often just scientists politely disagreeing with great intensity over fragments of bone and bits of stone. By about 250,000 years ago, There were humans whose skulls, faces and bodies were recognisably ours in the broad sense. They were not identical to any population alive today, of course. Human variation has always existed, and evolution never truly stops tidying and rearranging the furniture. But these were not creatures standing at the edge of humanity. They were already inside it. That matters because many of our instincts about progress depend on a hidden assumption. We imagine that if civilization came late, then fully modern minds must also have come late. It feels intuitive. Surely you get the big brain, then the big ideas, then the cities, then the books, then the very regrettable invention of email. But evolution and history do not move in such a neat order. A species can possess the mental hardware for far more than its environment currently allows it to build. Potential is not the same thing as immediate expression. Give a brilliant engineer no metal, no glass, no writing, no settled food supply, no large population, and no institutions for preserving knowledge, and you will not get a steam engine. You will get a very intelligent person trying to keep everyone warm, fed, and alive with the materials at hand. In that sense, early Homo sapiens were carrying around minds with extraordinary capabilities long before those capabilities could accumulate into what we now call civilization. They could observe, remember, infer, cooperate, teach, deceive, plan, and imagine. They could track animals from subtle signs in the ground. They could likely infer intentions from faces and tone. They could learn from older members of the group and adapt techniques to new conditions. They would have known plants, places, seasons, hazards, and relationships with a level of practical detail that most modern people would find overwhelming after about 20 minutes. Many of us, if dropped into one of their landscapes with our current skill set, would contribute very little beyond vague moral support and an unhelpful opinion about whether the berries look fine actually. The phrase anatomically modern can sound dry, but it conceals something quite dramatic. It means the basic body plan was already there. A rounded skull, a lighter skeleton than earlier human species, a face tucked more neatly beneath the brain case rather than projecting strongly outward, a chin which remains one of evolution's more peculiar decisions, and crucially, a brain within the modern human range. Now, brain size by itself is not a magic number. Neanderthals had large brains too, in some cases larger on average than ours. The important point is not that Homo sapiens suddenly became smart in the narrow exam room sense. It is that our species possessed a combination of physical and neurological traits that supported flexible behaviour, broad social learning, and adaptation across many different environments. That flexibility is one of the best clues that these people were already operating with a deeply human style of intelligence. Earlier human species had also been capable, inventive, and impressive. It would be a mistake to turn the story into everyone before us was fumbling around until we arrived. Neanderthals survived for hundreds of thousands of years in demanding environments. Other human relatives dispersed widely and used tools in sophisticated ways. Evolution is not a pageant where one species wins the sash for best hominin. Still, Homo sapiens seems to have been especially good at something that would later matter enormously: managing variety. New environments, new prey, new social contacts, new techniques, new combinations of old ideas. That talent for flexibility, especially when joined to social learning, is one of the foundations of everything that came later. There is, however, a second complication, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Even if early humans were already physically modern, were they mentally modern in the way we usually imagine? Here archaeology becomes both fascinating and slightly frustrating. Bones tell us what bodies looked like, but minds do not fossilize. No one has yet excavated a thought. We infer mental life from behavior, from tools, pigments, ornaments, burials, engravings, and the organization of living spaces. That evidence suggests a gradual deepening and widening of symbolic behavior rather than one single dramatic leap. In other words, there was probably no glorious Tuesday afternoon. on which humanity suddenly became imaginative. Instead, the picture looks more like a long, uneven build. We see early use of pigments, perhaps for body decoration or marking. We see carefully made stone tools requiring planning and skill. We see transport of materials over distances, implying memory, movement, or exchange. We see ornaments made from shells or beads in some places. We see probable rituals, though archaeology must be cautious here because scientists, like everyone else, are occasionally tempted to describe anything mysterious as either ritual or a prestige item. But taken together, these traces point toward minds that were not merely solving immediate physical problems. They were also representing identity, meaning, and social distinction. They were doing things that mattered because people agreed they mattered. That may sound obvious, but it is actually one of the deepest features of human life. Much of what makes humans unusual is not raw intelligence alone but shared imagination. A wolf pack coordinates, ants coordinate, many animals coordinate, humans coordinate around stories, norms, obligations, kinship categories, group symbols, remembered ancestors, invisible rules, and future plans. We live not only in the physical world but inside a social world built from agreed meanings. Once a group can say, in effect, this mark means us, this place belongs to these dead, this person owes that person, or this season requires that ceremony, it has entered a level of collective reality that is recognizably human. So when we look at early Homo sapiens, the right image is not an empty-minded forager reacting only to the next meal. It is a person embedded in a web of memory and expectation. Someone who knows who is related to whom, who can be trusted, who must be avoided, where water lies after the rains, which tree bark can help a fever, what happened 2 dry seasons ago, why the old woman dislikes that man from the neighbouring group, and why no one should speak lightly about a certain place after dark. That is not primitive simplicity. That is dense social intelligence. In many respects, it is the kind of intelligence our own minds are still designed for, even if we now spend far too much of it remembering passwords. One reason this matters is that it changes how we understand slowness. If humans were already human, then the long delay before agriculture, writing, and cities cannot be explained by saying the species was waiting for consciousness to arrive. The essential capacities were already there. The delay came from something else. It came from the conditions under which those capacities were operating. Human minds were capable, but they existed in a world where most energy went into immediate survival, where knowledge was fragile, where population was sparse, and where cumulative complexity had a hard time sticking. You can think of it in terms of spare mental bandwidth, though that phrase is a bit modern and sounds as if early humans ought to have upgraded their software. When daily life is uncertain, experimentation is expensive. Innovation still happens, but it happens under pressure and within limits. A better stone point is worth the effort because it may help bring down an animal. A decorative object may matter because it signals belonging or status. A story may survive because it helps encode practical information or group values. But the chain that leads from one useful improvement to a long uninterrupted sequence of stored, shared, expanded knowledge is difficult to maintain without stable communities and wider networks. This is another reason the old image of human progress as a straight staircase is so misleading. Early humans did not simply move from not really human to fully human, and then from fully human to civilized. It was much messier than that. Bodies became modern. Behaviours accumulated gradually. Some innovations appeared early in one place and much later in another. Symbolic practices came and went. Tool traditions changed, spread, vanished, and reappeared. Human life was already rich, but richness was not yet easily preserved on a large scale. The species had the capacity for far more than any single generation could keep alive. There is something quietly moving about that. For tens of thousands of years, people carried within them abilities that the world around them could only partly express. They had the same basic emotional machinery we do. They likely loved, feared, envied, mourned, laughed, remembered slights for far too long, and worried about children who wandered out of sight. They lived in families, they formed attachments, they noticed unfairness, they taught by demonstration and correction. They probably told stories to explain dangerous places, strange weather, remarkable animals, and the dead. They almost certainly had social tensions, because put more than 6 humans together for long enough, and someone will become irritated by how someone else chews. And all of this was happening long before written history, which means that most of the human experience never announced itself in words that survived. No diaries, no epics preserved on parchment, no legal codes carved into stone, just lives, repeated and varied over immense spans of time, mothers carrying infants, children learning names for things, adolescents trying to prove themselves, older people becoming libraries of memory, hunters returning with success or failure written on their faces before they said a word, fires tended, meat divided, disputes settled badly or well, bonds formed with outsiders, warnings passed on, grief made social through ritual. These are not minor background details before the real story starts. They are the texture from which the later story is made. It is also worth saying that being already human did not mean being identical to us in every cognitive detail. Human minds develop in interaction with culture, and culture changes the mind in return. A person raised in a small foraging group with no writing and no cities would attend to the world differently than someone raised in a literate industrial society. Memory strategies would differ. Perception of landscape would differ. Social obligations would be structured differently. The amount of ecological knowledge expected of an ordinary person would likely dwarf anything most of us carry. So the point is not that ancient humans were just modern office workers in need of better transport links. The point is that the core capacities were present. The differences lie in what culture trained those capacities to do. This helps explain one of the most misleading habits in popular thinking about prehistory, which is to confuse technological simplicity with mental simplicity. A stone tool can be technologically simple and still be used by a mind that is anything but simple. In fact, making many kinds of stone tools requires planning, motor skill, material knowledge, and often long apprenticeship. There is a tendency among modern people to look at polished electronics and assume intelligence rises in proportion to shininess. By that standard, a smartphone is a masterpiece, and a hand axe is a sad little pebble with career limitations. But intelligence does not reside in the glamour of the object. It resides in the system of knowledge, perception, and transmission that makes the object possible and useful. The hand axe, the spear point, the scraper, the awl, the fire-hardened wooden shaft, the carefully chosen adhesive, the carried ember, the woven container, the seasonal route remembered across years, these all belong to a practical world of remarkable competence. And because that competence was mostly embodied and oral, it remained vulnerable. Lose the skilled elders, lose the route, lose the toolmaker, lose the technique, lose contact with neighbouring groups, lose access to new materials and new ideas. A great deal of early human life depended on continuous teaching face to face. That is powerful, but it is also fragile. There is a temptation here to ask when exactly humans became behaviourally modern, as if there must be a ceremonial ribbon-cutting moment. Archaeologists have debated this for years. Some argue for a relatively late flowering of symbolic complexity around 50,000 years ago. Others point to earlier African evidence showing that many supposedly modern behaviours were present much earlier in scattered form. The most sensible view may be that fully human behaviour emerged in pieces, unevenly, and under different conditions in different places. That is less dramatic than a single revolution, but more plausible. Human life usually becomes clearer when we trade miracle moments for long processes. And long processes are what this story is really about. If you stand too close to prehistory, you see scattered artifacts and empty time. If you step back a bit, a different pattern appears. First came bodies that were already ours in the essential anatomical sense. Then, across many millennia, behaviours that reveal symbolic thought, social complexity, and innovation become more visible. None of it is instant. None of it is neat. But the idea of already human becomes harder and harder to resist. The species did not spend 200,000 years waiting to become real. It spent them living. There is also a humility in recognising this. We are not the first real people at the end of a long corridor of half-people. We are one recent arrangement of a much older kind of mind. The people of the deep past were not extras in a documentary whose main job was to die before the invention of architecture. They were as central to their own lives as we are to ours. They woke tired, got hungry, felt attachment, made decisions with incomplete information, tried to read other people's intentions, and lived inside communities whose rules were both supportive and constraining. In that sense, they are familiar, almost uncomfortably so. The deep past is full of people who are not waiting for us. They were busy being themselves. Once that sinks in, another question begins to matter more than the old one about intelligence. If humans were already human, what kind of world were they living in that kept change so gradual? What was daily life like when everyone around you was clever, observant, socially entangled, and fully capable of learning? Yet the scale of collective progress remained modest. The answer lies less in the individual mind and more in the size and structure of the group. Human beings may already have had the hardware for astonishing things, but for most of this story they lived in very small communities, scattered across large landscapes, carrying almost everything important in memory, habit, and conversation. And once you place a modern kind of mind inside that kind of social world, the pace of change begins to make a great deal more sense. Once we picture those early humans more accurately, the next part of the story becomes easier to understand. They were intelligent, social, adaptable, and fully human in the ways that mattered most, but they did not live in a human world that looked anything like the one we know. They lived in small bands, not nations, not cities, not even villages for most of this long stretch, but little groups of people moving through landscapes that were vast, uncertain, and often unforgiving. And that changes almost everything. A small band is not just a population statistic, it is a whole way of being in the world. It means that nearly everyone around you is someone you know personally. There is no such thing as an anonymous crowd. No bureaucrat, no landlord, no teacher who lives 3 districts over, no one writing policies, no one operating a distant court, no one posting strange opinions to thousands of strangers before breakfast. There is just the group, perhaps a few dozen people, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, and the network of relationships inside it. Family, close allies, rivals, in-laws, children, elders, the competent, the difficult, the funny, the trusted, the unreliable, and the person who insists they know exactly where the herd moved and is either a genius or about to ruin everyone's afternoon. That small scale shaped human life so deeply that it is probably still written into parts of our psychology. We are in many ways creatures built for repeated interaction with familiar individuals. We notice status, fairness, loyalty, tone of voice, facial expressions, shared history, and who failed to help last time. We are remarkably good at tracking the social weather of a group. Who is angry with whom? Who can be depended on? Who is likely to overreact? Who needs comforting? Who is trying too hard to impress people? Who is actually competent? And who is merely very enthusiastic? In a small band, this kind of social knowledge is not gossip in the trivial sense. It is survival information. Life in such groups required cooperation of an intense and constant kind. Food often had to be obtained collectively. Children had to be watched, taught, and protected. Injuries had to be managed. Camps had to be maintained. Fire had to be preserved. Decisions had to be made about movement, danger, weather, scarce resources, and contact with outsiders. If one person failed badly enough in the wrong moment, everyone could pay for it. That created a world in which social relationships carried enormous weight. To be excluded, mistrusted, or abandoned was not merely emotionally painful, it could be fatal. At the same time, small bands were not tiny utopias of mutual understanding, where everyone shared berries and wisdom in perfect harmony. They were made of humans, which means they included affection and irritation in roughly equal measure. Cooperation is never free. It requires negotiation, memory, reciprocity, and often the management of resentment. If one hunter repeatedly takes credit for animals others helped track, people notice. If someone avoids unpleasant tasks too often, people notice. If a person becomes domineering, unreliable, or dangerous, the group has to respond somehow. Small communities can be wonderfully supportive, but they can also be claustrophobic. There is nowhere to disappear into a crowd and reinvent yourself as mysterious. In a group of 30, everyone knows perfectly well that you're not mysterious. You're the person who forgot to cover the fire last week. Still, these bands worked, and they worked for a very long time, which tells us something important. This was not a failed early draft of human society. It was a successful adaptation under the conditions people faced. Small groups were flexible. They could move when local resources failed. They could split when tensions became too great. They could merge or exchange members with neighbouring groups when alliances mattered. They did not need to feed thousands of mouths from a single place. They did not depend on grain stores, walls, administrative systems, or a class of people whose main role was to count everyone else's jars. For mobile foragers living in landscapes with shifting opportunities, small bands made sense. The problem, at least from the perspective of later progress, is that what makes a system good at survival in one context may make it slow to accumulate complexity across generations. A small band can preserve an astonishing amount of practical knowledge, but only within limits. The total number of people who can carry that knowledge is small. The number of apprentices is small. The number of chances for any given skill to be improved is small. The number of different specialisms the group can support is also small, because nearly everyone must remain involved in basic survival. In a tiny community, no one gets to become an expert in abstract mathematics while everyone else handles the antelope situation. This is one of the central tensions in the story. Small groups can be beautifully adapted to their environment, but they are not ideal machines for cumulative innovation. There are simply fewer minds, fewer interactions between minds, fewer chances that one useful idea will meet another useful idea and produce a third. A clever improvement may emerge and stay local. It may be transmitted faithfully, or half-faithfully, or badly. It may disappear when the one especially skilled person dies. It may fail to spread because neighbouring groups are distant, suspicious, or occupied with their own immediate problems. In such a world, progress has a hard time building momentum. We should be careful here not to confuse slowness with stagnation. The world of small bands was not frozen. It was full of change, but the change was often local, gradual, and uneven. One group might refine a hunting technique. Another might become especially skilled at exploiting coastal foods. Another might develop social ties that allow marriage exchange or information sharing over a larger area. Some groups may have used certain ornaments or pigments while others did not. Some landscapes encouraged one kind of toolkit, some another. Human life was adaptive and inventive, but its inventiveness was dispersed across space and time rather than concentrated into visible revolutions. And scale matters in another way too. In a small band, the amount of social complexity you can handle is very different from the amount a city can handle. You do not need formal institutions to manage 50 people in the way you need them to manage 50,000. In a band, many rules can remain unwritten because everyone learns them directly. Obligations are personal, memory is social. Justice, to the extent we can even use that word here, is embedded in relationships rather than codified in law. If someone behaves badly, the response may be criticism, ridicule, pressure from kin, separation, or in some cases violence. There is no office of public administration and no clerk muttering that the request was filed incorrectly. There is just the group trying to keep itself coherent. This sounds simple on the surface, but it demands impressive emotional and cognitive skill. To live in a small band is to live in a permanent web of interdependence. You cannot afford to misread everyone all the time. You must know how to share enough to maintain ties without surrendering every advantage. You must know when to press, when to ease off, when to forgive, when to remember, and when to pretend not to notice something for the sake of peace. Children in such communities would have learned not only physical skills but social ones with incredible intensity, because every adult around them mattered and every relationship had consequences. This way of life also shaped time itself. In the modern world, time is chopped into schedules, deadlines, shifts, quarters, school terms, fiscal years, train departures, and the deeply personal crisis of realizing it is somehow already Thursday. In the slow world of small bands, time was structured differently. It moved with light, weather, migration, ripening, rainfall, cold, scarcity, abundance, and memory. Not in a dreamy or vague way, but in a practical one. When do the animals move? When does the water shrink? When do certain plants become useful? When does the coast yield more food? When does the dry season become dangerous? These were not scenic observations, they were the calendar that mattered. That seasonal orientation helped produce deep ecological intelligence. People living in small groups across generations in the same broad environments could know astonishing amounts about the land. The behaviour of animals, the character of soils, the location of seasonal water, the uses of plants, the safe pathways through difficult terrain, the patterns of wind and cloud, the signs of predators, the timing of insects, the useful properties of wood, stone, bone, fibre, and resin. This knowledge could be subtle, cumulative, and highly local. It was a form of expertise, and a very demanding one. The trouble is that local expertise does not automatically become global transformation. It helps a group endure in place. It does not necessarily spill outward into a general acceleration of technology. Mobility made this even more pronounced. Many hunter-gatherer groups moved seasonally or opportunistically because mobility was efficient. If food sources shifted, people shifted. If resources were exhausted locally, people moved on. If a drought made one area dangerous, they sought another. This meant that possessions had to remain portable, or at least worth carrying. Heavy infrastructure was less attractive. Massive storage systems, monumental architecture, and large permanent workshops make less sense when the landscape itself is part of your strategy. The world of small bands rewarded knowledge carried in minds and bodies more than knowledge fixed in permanent institutions. This is one reason the archaeological record can make early human life look materially sparse. Portable things are often simpler than settled things, at least in outward appearance. But that should not fool us. A light toolkit can still belong to a sophisticated society if the people using it possess rich knowledge, efficient cooperation, and flexible strategies. A small mobile band with the right skills can survive conditions that would destroy a larger, less adaptable group. There is a practical elegance in that. Yet from the point of view of long-term accumulation, portability has a cost. The more your world lives in memory, custom, and repeated practice, the more vulnerable it is to disruption. And disruption was everywhere. Injury, disease, failed hunts, climatic shifts, conflict with neighbouring groups, dangerous animals, and plain bad luck all shaped life at this scale. We sometimes talk about prehistory as though it were one broad stable background, but in reality many human groups lived through repeated environmental swings, especially during the Pleistocene. Glacial and interglacial periods altered habitats dramatically. Lakes expanded and vanished, grasslands shifted, forests changed, coastlines moved, animals migrated or disappeared. Small bands were resilient precisely because they were flexible, but constant adaptation leaves little surplus for grand experimentation. That word surplus matters more than it first appears. Progress in the cumulative sense often depends on spare capacity. Spare food, spare labour, spare time, spare stability, spare attention. A society does not need infinite comfort to innovate, and in fact hardship can drive useful creativity. But it does need enough security, often over long periods, for knowledge to be stored, refined and transmitted beyond immediate crisis. In small bands, surplus was thin and irregular. If you have just enough to keep going, then the practical question is not, what grand new system shall we invent, but how do we get through this season without anyone dying unnecessarily? That is why the phrase slow world should not suggest a lazy one. It was slow because it was hard. Hard not merely in the obvious physical sense, though that mattered, but in the systemic sense. Every gain had to be defended against loss. Every skill had to be taught face to face. Every social tie had to be maintained without institutions. Every child represented hope and risk. Every elder was a library that mortality would eventually close. In such a world, continuity itself was an achievement, and continuity was never guaranteed. One of the most important consequences of small group size is cultural fragility. We often imagine knowledge as something a population naturally accumulates once discovered, but this is not true. Knowledge can shrink as well as grow. Techniques can disappear. Skills can become simpler if the number of practitioners falls. Networks can collapse. Tool traditions can become less elaborate if maintaining them becomes too costly or too difficult in a reduced population. There is evidence from various parts of the world that cultural complexity can wax and wane with demography and connectivity. More people and better connected groups often support richer, more stable traditions. Fewer people and weaker networks make loss more likely. That means the slow world of small bands was not simply waiting for the future. It was constantly trying not to forget the past. The challenge was not only invention, but retention. A good idea is one thing. A good idea that survives the death of its inventor, travels to another group, gets improved there, returns in altered form, and becomes normal practice across a larger network, that is much rarer. And this is precisely the kind of process that later history becomes better and better at. Early foraging life, by contrast, often ran on what might be called intimate transmission. Knowledge passed from eye to hand, from mouth to ear, from elder to child, from one season to the next. Powerful, yes. Permanent, not always. Even contact between groups when it happened could be uncertain. Neighbouring bands might exchange mates, materials, stories, or techniques. They might also avoid one another, distrust one another, or fight. Social networks probably existed at many times and in many places, and they mattered enormously. They allowed genes, information, and objects to move across wider landscapes. But these networks were not dense, constant, or universally peaceful. They were limited by distance, environment, and the hazards of meeting strangers in a world without police, passports, or the useful modern phrase just circling back on this. All of this helps explain why history appears to idle for so long. It was not that humans lacked ideas. It was that the social containers for those ideas were small, mobile, fragile, and under pressure. Human beings were already capable of accumulating culture, but the rate at which culture could build and stay built was constrained by demography. Too few people, spread too far apart, carrying too much in memory, living too close to the edge of necessity. The marvel is not that progress was slow. The marvel is that anything accumulated at all. And yet it did. Across vast spans of time, within and between these small bands, people refined tools, expanded into new habitats, strengthened social learning, and built shared worlds of meaning. They managed to preserve enough, teach enough, and connect enough that later thresholds could eventually be crossed. But while those thresholds were still distant, Everyday life remained anchored in the realities of the small group. You woke among people you knew. You moved through land that had to be read carefully. You depended on cooperation that could never be taken for granted. You inherited a body of knowledge that might save your life, and you were expected to carry some part of it forward. Seen from our present moment, where millions of people can adopt an idea overnight and then argue about it for years, the world of small bands feels almost unimaginably quiet. But it was not quiet from the inside. It was full of conversation, attention, tension, adaptation, practical reasoning, and social calculation. It only seems slow because the scale was small and the traces are faint. To the people living it, each day would have contained enough urgency to fill an entire universe. And because so much energy was absorbed by staying alive inside that universe, there was rarely much room left over for the kind of cumulative transformation that later ages would call progress. And once life is seen at that scale, inside small groups facing immediate problems in landscapes that could turn hostile without warning, another piece of the puzzle begins to fall into place. Progress was slow, not simply because populations were small, though they were. It was slow because most people spent most of their time dealing with the next practical necessity. Find food, protect children, keep warm, avoid injury, manage conflict, watch the weather, preserve fire, stay alert, repeat. It is difficult to build a world of rapid cumulative advancement when nearly every day is already full before breakfast. Modern people often underestimate just how much effort survival used to require, partly because successful modern life is built on layers of hidden infrastructure. You turn on a tap and water appears, you flip a switch and light arrives. Food waits in a shop, already sorted, packaged, and generally not trying to run away. Shelter, unless something has gone badly wrong, remains in place during the night. You're surrounded by systems so reliable that you barely notice them until one fails, and suddenly the mood in the household deteriorates with impressive speed. Early humans had no such cushioning. Nearly everything that sustained life had to be secured directly, repeatedly, and with skill. That does not mean every day was a desperate scramble from dawn to dusk, as though prehistoric life consisted entirely of screaming, sprinting, and clutching a spear, while dramatic music played in the background. Hunter-gatherer life could include rest, laughter, storytelling, social bonding, ritual, and periods of relative plenty. Some foraging societies and good environments may even have had more leisure time than many people in later agricultural or industrial societies. But leisure in that sense does not mean freedom from vulnerability. It means that on a good day, in a good season, with enough local knowledge and a functioning social group, people could meet their needs without working themselves into the ground every waking hour. The larger fact remains that the margin for error was thin, and thin margins change how societies behave. When your world is built on a narrow margin, failure becomes expensive. A failed hunt is not a disappointing afternoon. It is lost calories. A wrongly identified plant is not a charming anecdote about trying something new. It is illness or death. A shift in animal migration, a late rain, a damaged tool, a twisted ankle, a sick child, a conflict that splits a group at the wrong moment. Each of these can place real strain on survival. Under those conditions, innovation tends to be conservative. People do change methods, of course. They experiment, observe, and adapt. But they cannot afford the modern luxury of repeated failure in pursuit of speculative future rewards. A new technique has to justify itself fairly quickly, or at least not endanger the group while being tested. This matters because a great deal of the progress we celebrate in hindsight depends on long chains of trial, error, preservation, and improvement. A useful tool does not usually appear fully formed. It emerges through many attempts, many mistakes, and many opportunities to refine. In societies with large populations, stored surpluses, and institutions that preserve knowledge, failure can be absorbed more easily. One inventor gets it wrong, but the workshop continues. One harvest is poor, but grain stores help. One scholar dies, but the book remains. In the deep past, most of that protection did not exist. If the experiment failed badly enough, it was not merely the idea that vanished. The person trying it, or the people depending on it, might vanish too. That is why survival pressure does not just reduce comfort, it reduces cultural momentum. It narrows the range of what can be risked. And because it narrows risk, it also narrows accumulation. Even when a clever solution appears, it may remain local and fragile because there is too little spare capacity to preserve, spread and elaborate it. People must prioritize what keeps the group going immediately. This is not a sign of limited imagination. It is a sign of rational behavior under hard conditions. Take food, the most obvious example. Obtaining calories in a foraging world required deep knowledge and constant responsiveness. Animals moved, plants ripened and vanished. Coasts offered opportunities that inland regions did not. Rivers flooded and shrank. Certain foods were abundant only briefly. Others required careful preparation to be safe. Some were useful only at a particular stage of growth. A community that survived well did so because it carried detailed local knowledge about what could be eaten, when, where, in what quantity, with what preparation, and with what risks. This kind of intelligence is sophisticated, but it is tied closely to the environment that produced it. It makes life possible. It does not automatically build long-distance systems of cumulative invention. There is also the matter of energy itself. Human bodies are costly things. They require fuel every day, and in physically demanding environments, that requirement becomes more pressing. Early humans had to walk, carry, climb, dig, track, prepare, haul, and endure cold or heat without modern assistance. Pregnancy, childbirth, and child-rearing added further demands, especially in mobile groups. Injuries had to be managed without surgery, infection control, pain relief beyond whatever local remedies existed, or the comforting phrase, "the ambulance is on its way." Even a minor problem could become serious in a world where rest was limited, sanitation was basic, and pathogens had no respect for the human desire to just get through this week. Children add another layer to the story. Human children are unusually dependent for unusually long periods. They cannot simply stand up, dust themselves off, and begin contributing to the household economy in any meaningful sense within a few months, however convenient that might have been for exhausted parents. They must be fed, protected, taught, watched, and socialized over many years. That prolonged dependency is one of the reasons human intelligence becomes so flexible, because childhood allows for extensive learning. But it is also costly. A group with many children has invested heavily in a future that still requires immense present effort. Adults are not merely surviving for themselves. They are carrying the metabolic and social load of the next generation. Older adults, meanwhile, could be enormously valuable as stores of knowledge, social memory, and skill. But supporting people who were less physically capable at certain times of life also required a functioning cooperative system. The same was true for the injured, the ill, and perhaps those who were simply having a terrible season of bad luck, which is a category broad enough to include most of humanity eventually. One of the remarkable features of our species is that we often do support one another beyond what strict immediate efficiency would demand, but that generosity, for all its moral beauty, is not free. It depends on reciprocity, expectation, kinship, and shared values, all of which require maintenance. Survival in human groups is never just about calories. It is about cooperation stable enough to move calories around. Once you see life in those terms, it becomes obvious why progress, as later ages define it, was not the daily priority. There was no Ministry of Innovation, no grant application, no separate class of people paid to think abstractly, while others managed the practical world below. There were just human beings living close enough to necessity that practical competence overshadowed almost everything else. That does not mean no one thought abstractly. They certainly did. Symbolism, ritual, language, memory, and social negotiation all require complex thought. But the surrounding structure of life did not make it easy to convert thought into steadily accumulating material transformation. In fact, many of the most impressive human skills in that world were precisely those least likely to leave behind obvious signs of advancement: the ability to read a landscape, the ability to infer danger from absence as much as presence, the ability to judge whether another group might be hostile, the ability to soothe a conflict before it became deadly, the ability to remember water sources across seasons, the ability to teach children not just what to do but when not to panic, the ability to coordinate a hunt or share scarce food without tearing the group apart. These are not minor talents, they are civilizational in miniature. But because they live in behaviour rather than monuments, we are tempted to treat them as background rather than achievement. Survival pressure also shapes the rhythm of attention. A society under frequent material strain tends to orient strongly toward the near future, not because people are incapable of long-term thought, but because the near future refuses to be ignored. If rain does not come, if herds do not appear, if someone falls ill, if conflict erupts, then the next few days matter more than the distant horizon. Long-term planning certainly existed, especially in seasonal movement, tool preparation, marriage alliances, and knowledge transmission. But long-term planning under unstable conditions often remains practical rather than expansive. The aim is continuity, not transformation, and continuity itself could be hard-won. One severe environmental change might force a group to relocate. One epidemic could reduce numbers sharply. One run of bad seasons might break a network of exchange or marriage ties that had taken generations to establish. In a world where social networks were already thin, disruption had outsized effects. Modern people sometimes imagine human progress as the default state once intelligence exists, as though inventions naturally pile up unless someone actively misplaces them. In reality, the default in harsh environments may be maintenance. Hold on to what works, teach it carefully, adjust where necessary, avoid unnecessary risk. Keep enough people alive that the knowledge remains embodied in someone. There is a revealing contrast here with later agricultural societies. Farming brought new hardships, many of them severe, but it also allowed in some places and under some conditions the production of more predictable food surpluses. Surplus changes everything because it can support storage, specialization, larger settlements, and eventually record keeping. Once those exist, the human relationship with time changes. Some people can work on projects whose payoff is not immediate. Some can become dedicated craftspeople, organizers, priests, scribes, builders, soldiers, traders, or administrators. Whether that improved daily happiness is another question entirely, and not always one with flattering answers. But in terms of cumulative complexity, surplus is a powerful engine. For most of the human story before farming, that engine either did not exist or operated only weakly and locally. There is also the simple fact that many innovations are only useful once other conditions are in place. Writing is transformative, but it makes little sense in a world with tiny mobile groups, low population density, and no state administration, trade bureaucracy, or surplus accounting to sustain it. Large permanent architecture is impressive, but less attractive if mobility is adaptive and materials must be carried. Certain specialized crafts require stable supply chains and repeated practice that small bands may not be able to support. So the absence of later technologies in earlier periods is not evidence that nobody was trying hard enough. It often means the surrounding ecology and social structure did not yet reward those technologies. This is one reason hindsight can be so unfair. We know where the story ends up, so we keep wanting earlier humans to get on with it. We look back and think, surely someone could have started farming sooner, or why did writing take so long? But this treats history like an exam where the right answers were always obvious at the back of the book. In reality, people respond to the incentives and constraints of the world they inhabit. If hunting and gathering work well enough in a given region, if mobility remains advantageous, if populations are low, if climate fluctuates, if surplus is uncertain, then many of the later ingredients of civilization are not yet attractive, necessary, or even possible. People were not dawdling. They were making rational decisions in environments that gave them limited room to do otherwise. And in those environments, success itself could be deceptive. A well-adapted foraging strategy might keep a group going for generations without generating the kind of surplus or density that leads to rapid structural change. Stability can slow visible progress precisely because it reduces pressure for radical transformation. If life works, not perfectly, but well enough, then there is less reason to abandon it. That is another important correction to the old myth. The deep past was not simply a misery so intolerable that civilization should have appeared as soon as possible. In many places, foraging lifeways were viable, intelligent, and in some respects preferable to what came later. Agriculture, after all, did not instantly turn everyone into philosophers with good posture. It often brought harder labour, worse diets, crowd disease, inequality, and new forms of dependence. The fact that humans did not rush into it everywhere is not surprising. Still, however workable foraging life could be, it remained exposed. Hardship was never far away. Climatic swings, population changes, local depletion, competition and misfortune could undo equilibrium quickly. And because so much rested on direct human effort, the energy left for non-essential experimentation remained limited. You can see the pattern almost as a budget. Every society has only so much time, labour, attention, and stored energy to allocate. In small foraging bands, a large proportion of that budget went straight into immediate survival and social maintenance. There was less left over for activities whose returns were indirect, delayed, or uncertain. The result was not no progress, but slow progress. That slowness becomes even easier to understand if we stop imagining survival and innovation as separate categories. In early human life, most innovation was survival innovation. Better ways to have to point, better methods for carrying fire, better knowledge of migration routes, better food processing, better social norms for sharing or alliance, better ways of remembering landscape through story, better childcare practices, better adaptation to local climates. These are real advances, but they rarely produce the dramatic visual effect of a city skyline emerging from a plain. They improve resilience instead. They thicken competence. They make a group better at remaining alive in a dangerous world. And perhaps that is the most important thing to remember here. From our modern vantage point, where the word progress often means visible technological acceleration, we easily overlook the monumental significance of survival itself. For early humans, surviving was not the absence of progress. It was the essential precondition for all later progress. Every child raised successfully, every skill transmitted, every winter endured, every alliance maintained, every route remembered, every tool technique preserved, these were the quiet victories on which everything else depended. Without them, there is no accumulation at all. Yet even when those victories happened, another problem remained. Knowledge in such a world could be hard won and still easy to lose. A group might discover a better method, refine a tool, or build up a body of expertise over generations, only for part of it to disappear with migration, conflict, demographic collapse, or the death of key individuals. So survival did not merely consume time and attention in the present, it also made the past more fragile. It meant that even genuine advances could slip through human fingers before they had the chance to settle and multiply. And that is where the story naturally moves next, because once survival has taken most of the available space, the question becomes what happened to the little that remained, and why so many good ideas had such a hard time staying alive. There is an uncomfortable truth at the centre of human history, and it is one that modern people do not always feel instinctively, because we live surrounded by stored knowledge. We assume that once a good idea appears, it more or less stays appeared. Someone discovers something useful, writes it down, teaches it, records it, uploads it, backs it up, translates it, places it in a library, and if all goes well, complains online when somebody else gets credit for it. We are used to a world in which knowledge can outlive individuals very easily. But for most of human existence, that was not the case at all. For a very long time, a good idea was not a stable possession of the species. It was a fragile thing, tied to particular people, particular groups, and particular conditions. And when those conditions changed, the idea could disappear almost as completely as if it had never existed. This is one of the main reasons progress stayed so slow for so long. It was not only that innovations were hard to produce, though often they were. It was that they were hard to keep. A useful method, a refined skill, a clever tool design, a way of preparing food safely, a route across difficult country, a practice for managing conflict, a technique for hunting a certain animal, a good adhesive mixture, a pattern for weaving, a story encoding practical information. Any of these might take years, even generations, to develop. But none of them came with a guarantee of survival. Knowledge had to live somewhere, and for most of prehistory it lived in human minds, human bodies, and social routines. That made it powerful, but it also made it vulnerable. Think for a moment about how much of what any society knows is never really written in explicit form even now. There is formal knowledge, yes, but there is also tacit knowledge, the sort you learn by watching, repeating, failing, and being corrected. How hard to strike a stone at the right angle, how to tell when wood has dried enough, how to read tracks that to an untrained eye look like meaningless marks, how to carry a baby while leaving your hands free, how to calm a frightened animal or a frightened child, how long to heat something before it becomes useful instead of ruined, how to sense that weather is turning before the sky fully shows it. Much of early human life depended on this kind of embedded skill. It cannot simply be handed over as a neat instruction manual. It has to be practiced with other people. That means every skilled individual was a storehouse. Every elder was a library. Every expert hunter, toolmaker, healer, or guide carried techniques and judgments that may have existed nowhere else in exactly the same form. If those people died unexpectedly, or if younger members failed to learn from them, the knowledge could fade fast. In a small band, where only a handful of people may have mastered a particular skill, loss was not theoretical, it was immediate. There was no archive to consult later, no neighbouring university department to ask for clarification, no dusty shelf containing Advanced Hafting Methods 3rd edition. There were only living people, and once the living link was broken, the tradition weakened. This is why population size matters so much for cultural history. A larger population does not merely produce more inventors, it also gives ideas more carriers, more teachers, more apprentices, more redundancy, more chances for a useful practice to survive the death or failure of one person. In a small scattered world, there may be only one especially skilled practitioner of something important within a wide area. In a larger, denser world, several people may know it, each in slightly different ways, and that difference is a form of protection. If one line of transmission breaks, another remains. For most of the human story, though, populations were too thin for knowledge to enjoy that kind of security. And there is another problem. Good ideas are often context-dependent. A technique that is brilliant in one landscape may be useless, or even dangerous in another. A hunting method suited to open grassland may fail in dense forest. A food processing trick may matter only where a certain plant grows. A social rule that stabilizes one group may create problems elsewhere. So even when people moved or made contact with outsiders, not everything travelled well. Ideas did not spread into a blank universal human setting. They spread into local worlds with their own ecologies, materials, habits, and pressures. Some innovations caught on, others remained tied to the conditions that gave birth to them. That localism is one reason early human progress looks patchy in the archaeological record. You see signs of innovation in one place, then silence. Evidence of symbolism here, then very little there. A refined tool tradition in one region, a simpler one elsewhere, then perhaps a reappearance under altered conditions later on. It can be tempting to read this pattern as inconsistency or lack of ability, but really it is what you would expect when culture is moving through small groups under unstable circumstances. Human beings were not failing to think. They were thinking in local settings where ideas had to earn their keep quickly and survive a great many hazards after doing so. One of the most important of those hazards was simple interruption. A drought could force movement. Movement could break teaching chains. Conflict could split a group. Splitting a group could leave too few people with some specific skill. A harsh season could shift priorities so sharply that no one had time to maintain a specialized practice. A child who would normally have learned from a grandparent might lose that grandparent too early. A network that once linked several bands through exchange or marriage might weaken for years. None of this requires catastrophe in the cinematic sense. Culture can be eroded by ordinary bad luck. This is difficult for modern minds to feel properly because we are used to backups. If a person dies now, the knowledge does not necessarily die with them. Their notes may remain, their students may remain, their work may be distributed across institutions. Even when expertise is rare, it is often buffered by storage and communication systems. By contrast, in a deep prehistoric setting, the chain between one generation and the next could be alarmingly direct. Miss a link, and something important may narrow or vanish. What we call loss of knowledge sounds abstract in a textbook. In reality, it means that some useful way of doing things simply stops being done because the people who carried it are no longer there. There is a more subtle kind of disappearance as well, and it may have been even more common. Sometimes good ideas do not vanish all at once, they shrink. A complex technique may be remembered imperfectly. A tool tradition may become simpler because fewer skilled teachers remain. A story may lose practical details while keeping its outline. A social ritual may continue after its original function has been partly forgotten. Knowledge can decay gradually, like a copied manuscript becoming less accurate with each generation, except in this case the manuscript is made of memory, imitation, and occasional correction around a fire. The transmission of skill is especially vulnerable to this sort of thinning. Imagine trying to teach a child a delicate practical technique using only demonstration, repetition, and speech, without writing, diagrams, or a broader community of specialists. It can be done, of course. Human beings have done exactly that for most of our existence. But it depends heavily on time, attention, and successful apprenticeship. If daily survival becomes more pressing, or if the group moves, or if the teacher dies, or if fewer learners are available, complexity may suffer. The result is not that all knowledge disappears, but that some of the finer points do. And sometimes what disappears is not the invention itself, but the confidence to maintain it. A demanding technique may be abandoned if simpler methods are good enough under current conditions. This is another important correction to how we think about progress. More complex is not always better. More efficient in one context may be more fragile in another. A small group under stress may prefer robust, easily taught methods over highly refined ones that require long training and favourable conditions. That is not backwardness, it is risk management. The deep past is full of sensible decisions that do not look impressive from the perspective of later civilizations. The lack of writing made all of this much harder. Writing is not just a way of communicating, it is a way of stabilizing memory outside the body. Once knowledge can exist in external marks, it can survive the death of individuals much more effectively. It can be copied, transported, compared, standardized, and argued over by people who never meet. None of that existed for most of human existence, so the burden on oral culture was enormous. Oral cultures can preserve astonishing amounts, especially when memory is socially valued and information is embedded in story, rhythm, ritual, or repeated practice. But oral preservation is never effortless. It requires constant renewal. It is a living process, not a storage box. If the process is disrupted, the stored world begins to thin. That is why memory itself was probably one of the great human technologies of prehistory. Not memory in the modern sense of trying and failing to remember where you left your keys, but cultural memory, a disciplined, shared effort to hold the world together in minds and routines. Stories may have carried maps, warnings, kinship, seasonal timings, and moral rules all at once. Ritual may have reinforced group identity and transmission. Repetition may have preserved tool sequences or food preparation methods. But even these strong mechanisms had limits. They were excellent at maintaining what a group repeatedly needed. They were less good at preserving rare, specialized, or context-sensitive innovations across demographic shocks and long distances. Distance itself was another enemy of continuity. Groups were often separated by wide landscapes, and contact was not guaranteed. A useful idea in one region might simply never reach another, or might do so only after many transformations. Trade and exchange networks certainly existed in various times and places, and they mattered a great deal. Materials moved, people moved, ornaments, techniques, and social connections moved. But these networks were uneven and vulnerable. They could strengthen or weaken with climate, population, fear, and geography. A single innovation did not spread across the species like a notification. It travelled, if it travelled at all, through bodies walking across difficult land and through relationships that had to be renewed. This helps explain why human history for so long resembles not a single growing flame but many scattered sparks. A useful idea appears here, persists for a while, dies out there, survives elsewhere, recombines in another place, perhaps goes missing entirely. Over very long periods, some things do accumulate, but they accumulate unevenly, with pauses, reversals, and disappearances built into the process. The miracle is not that early humans failed to build uninterrupted progress. The miracle is that enough continuity existed despite all this for cumulative culture to keep deepening at all. There is also the uncomfortable fact that some kinds of knowledge become easier to lose precisely because they are too successful. If a practice becomes second nature, fewer people may understand it analytically. They just do it because that is how it is done. This is true in modern life too. Most people can use technologies they do not remotely understand. In prehistory, the same basic principle may have applied on a smaller scale. A group may know how to do something effectively without everyone grasping the full chain of skill behind it. If the few who truly master the process disappear, the rest may be left with only fragments. What looked stable can unravel surprisingly fast. Children, once again, sit at the heart of this. Every human society depends on the transfer of competence to the young, but children are not storage devices. They are learners, partial learners for many years, and they are learning under conditions of distraction, danger, fatigue, and changing circumstance. Teaching takes time that adults under pressure may not always have in abundance. Some skills must be delayed until bodies are older and judgment steadier. Some are learned only through repeated exposure over many seasons. If anything interrupts that sequence, the result may be a generation slightly less skilled in a crucial area than the one before it. Multiply that process across time, and you begin to see how cultural simplification can happen without any dramatic collapse. There is a tendency to imagine that prehistoric people, because they lived closer to necessity, must have held on to every useful idea with grim determination. But usefulness is not a permanent property. An idea useful in one season, region, or demographic situation may become irrelevant in another. If a prey species declines, certain hunting methods may no longer matter. If a group relocates, local ecological knowledge may become obsolete. If contact with outsiders diminishes, exchange-dependent practices may fade. If a population shrinks, the social support for a specialized tradition may disappear. Ideas survive not only by being clever, but by fitting a current world. and current worlds change climatically, socially, geographically, demographically. A river shifts, a coastline recedes, a formerly rich patch becomes unreliable. A corridor once linking groups becomes dangerous or barren. A marriage network weakens. A conflict leaves distrust in its wake. Under those circumstances, cultural life has to adapt, and adaptation often involves pruning as much as adding. Some good ideas keep the group alive. Others, though brilliant in another setting, are left behind. From the distance of thousands of years, it can look like an inexplicable regression. From the inside, it may have been a sensible adjustment to a new reality. What all of this means is that early human progress was fighting two battles at once. The first was to generate useful knowledge. The second, equally important and often harder, was to stop that knowledge from leaking away. And leakage was constant, through mortality, through migration, through imperfect teaching, through isolation, through environmental change, through the sheer cost of maintaining complex traditions in very small populations. That double burden makes slowness look not only understandable, but almost inevitable. Yet there is something strangely hopeful in this as well, because if good ideas kept disappearing, the fact that any accumulated at all tells us something remarkable about human beings. They were not just inventing, they were building social methods for memory. Through language, ritual, imitation, shared norms, exchange, and the patient work of teaching, they kept fighting against forgetting. Every successful transmission was a small victory against loss. Every skill that made it through another generation increased the chances that future generations would begin a little further forward, rather than from the beginning again. This is where the long history of humanity starts to look less like a blank delay, and more like a quiet struggle to make improvement stick. The issue was never only creativity. Humans were creative early and often. The issue was durability. Could a good idea survive people? Could it survive distance? Could it survive scarcity? Could it survive the collapse of a group or the shifting of a landscape? For a very long time, the answer was only sometimes. Eventually, that would begin to change. Populations would grow in some regions. Networks would become denser. Some groups would settle more permanently. Surplus would begin to appear more reliably. Knowledge would start to circulate through wider and more stable systems. Later still, writing would allow memory to escape the fragility of flesh altogether. But before any of that, there was this long human condition in which intelligence was abundant and continuity was precious, where the species kept discovering things and then, with tragic regularity, dropping some of them back into the dark. And once you see that, another part of the old story comes into focus, because it becomes impossible to describe those early humans as inactive or empty-handed. On the contrary, they were often brilliantly capable. The deeper surprise is how much they managed to achieve despite living in a world so good at making achievement vanish. And that, in a way, is what makes the next part of the story so easy to miss. When people imagine the deep past, they often see only absence. No roads, no libraries, no written laws, no metal cities, no institutions, no recognizable machines humming in the background. From that absence, a false impression appears almost automatically. If the visible signs of civilization are not there, then perhaps the minds were not there either. Perhaps these early humans were clever only in the narrow animal sense, good at reacting, good at coping, but not yet capable of the kind of thought that deserves real admiration. It is one of the oldest mistakes we make about our ancestors, and one of the least fair. Because the more closely you look, the more the opposite seems true. Early humans were often astonishingly capable. Their brilliance was not missing. It was simply living in forms that modern people are not trained to notice. Part of the problem is that we are biased toward technologies that leave hard edges behind. We admire what can be photographed in a museum case. We admire what stacks, towers, glaze, shines, or can be given a clean label and a date. We are much less instinctively impressed by a person who can stand in a landscape and read it with extraordinary precision. A person who can infer from tracks, weather, smell, silence, and tiny disturbances what happened there hours before. A person who knows where water hides in a dry season, which roots can be eaten after careful preparation, which animal paths are worth following, which are a waste of precious energy, and which are an invitation to become something else's dinner. Yet these are forms of intelligence, and very demanding ones. In some environments they are more valuable than anything that could be done with a keyboard, a spreadsheet, or a motivational wall calendar. Early human life required what might be called total attention. Not constant panic, but constant awareness. The world had to be observed actively because it was full of information and consequences. The ground told stories, the sky told stories, animal behaviour told stories, the changing quality of light, the movement of insects, the taste of water, the shape of clouds, the condition of plants, all of it could matter. And learning to read those signals was not a matter of idle curiosity. It was tied to survival. The brilliant person in such a world was not the one who could perform abstract feats in isolation from life, but the one who could perceive meaningful patterns in a noisy, changing environment and act on them in time. That kind of brilliance is difficult to measure after the fact because it leaves so little behind. Stone tools survive. Ecological judgment does not. A shell bead survives. A conversation in which an elder corrected a child's understanding of the seasons does not. A burial may survive. The emotional and social world that made the burial meaningful mostly vanishes. We are left with artifacts, and artifacts are only the hard tips of much larger systems of thought. A carefully made point, scraper, blade, or hafted spear is not merely an object. It is the end point of observation, planning, technique, material knowledge, and teaching. It represents selection of stone, understanding of fracture, control of force, awareness of purpose, and usually repeated refinement over many years. None of that is simple just because the finished object fits in your hand. In fact, one of the most revealing things about early tools is how much invisible knowledge they imply. Even the choice of raw material could require considerable understanding. Not all stone behaves the same way. Some fractures predictably, some poorly. Some holds an edge, some dulls too quickly. Some is worth carrying over long distances, which tells us that people were not just reacting moment by moment but making judgments about future usefulness. Once you begin to notice that, a hand axe or blade stops looking like a crude relic from a dim age and starts looking like evidence of a mind capable of balancing multiple variables at once. Purpose, material, effort, transport, repair, training and use. That is engineering in the broad human sense, even if it is not yet accompanied by hard hats and health and safety briefings. Then there is hunting, which modern imagination persistently oversimplifies. It is often pictured as a straightforward test of strength or courage, as though the basic process involved running at something large and hoping confidence would solve the rest. But successful hunting in many prehistoric settings demanded memory, patience, cooperation, timing, anticipation, and very fine reading of behaviour. To know where an animal would move, how wind would affect scent, how a herd reacts under pressure, when to remain still, when to circle, when to commit, when to abandon the attempt, all of that requires more than bravery. It requires a predictive model of other living things, built from repeated observation. It is a science without writing, a field study without notebooks, and failure in it often had more serious consequences than a disappointing grade. The same is true of gathering, which has long been insultingly underestimated, because it sounds unglamorous to people who hear the word and picture casual berry picking on a pleasant afternoon. In reality, gathering could involve a highly developed understanding of landscapes, seasons, plant chemistry, tuber locations, seed processing, food storage opportunities where available, and the shifting reliability of different resources over the year. In many human societies, gathered foods formed a substantial and often dependable part of the diet. The knowledge involved was rarely trivial. Which plants are edible only at certain stages? which are poisonous unless leached, roasted, ground, or soaked. Which parts of the plant matter? Where does it grow after certain rains? How long can it be kept? What else can it be used for? Medicine, fibre, pigment, binding. This is not the work of passive people filling time between more exciting activities. It is deep, practical knowledge layered over generations. And because so much of this intelligence was practical, social and ecological, early humans may in some respects have been exercising parts of the mind more intensely than many modern people do. A person living in a small foraging band had to know individuals closely, navigate alliances, read intentions, remember obligations, monitor fairness, teach children, notice environmental shifts, and preserve technical skill without external storage. It is an enormous cognitive load, not necessarily the same as reading a legal contract or debugging a computer program, but not lesser for that. Merely different, and in many ways far more immediate. Modern life allows a great deal of cognitive outsourcing. Phones remember numbers, maps remember routes, books remember facts, search engines remember almost everything else. Early humans carried far more of the world in their own minds and in the minds of those around them. It is worth pausing on that, because memory itself may have been one of the great masterpieces of early human life. Not memory in the vague modern sense of trying to hold on to an appointment or a shopping list, but socially structured memory, reinforced through repetition, story, rhythm, ritual, place, and use. A route through a seasonal landscape is not just remembered once. It is walked, discussed, corrected, and tied to events and warnings. Knowledge of an animal is not just filed away. It is associated with tracks, seasons, scents, sounds, stories of hunts, mistakes made by older generations, and perhaps moral lessons attached to behaviour. This makes memory durable in a particular way, not perfect, but rich. Knowledge is woven into life rather than stored apart from it. That weaving helps explain why symbolic behaviour appears so early and so persistently in human life. Ornament, pigment, burial, engraving, body decoration, ritual practice. These things are sometimes treated as luxury extras, as though people turned to them only once all the serious practical business was finished. But symbolism is practical for humans. It creates shared meaning. It stabilizes identity. It marks belonging. It reinforces memory. It signals status, age, kinship, alliance, and obligation. It helps groups coordinate around invisible things, and invisible things are among the most powerful forces in human society. Rules are invisible. Promises are invisible. Kinship is invisible in the abstract. Group identity is invisible until embodied in marks, stories, gestures, and expectations. Once early humans began building symbolic worlds, they were not drifting away from practical life. They were strengthening one of the main tools that makes human cooperation possible. Art belongs here too, though the word can mislead because it sounds museum-like and detached from necessity. Cave paintings, engravings, beads, figurines, ochre use. All these may have served many purposes at once. Beauty, ritual, identity, teaching, memory, prestige, emotional expression, spiritual meaning. Humans rarely do one thing for one reason only. That is true now and was almost certainly true then. A mark on a wall might be an image, a memory aid, a sacred act, a territorial signal, a teaching device, or some combination of all of them. What matters for our story is that these practices reveal minds working beyond the immediate present. Minds representing, remembering, imagining, and communicating through symbols. Minds already fully engaged in the distinctly human act of building shared worlds inside the visible one. There is also the matter of social intelligence, which may be the most underrated form of prehistoric brilliance of all. It takes remarkable skill to keep a small interdependent group functioning over time. You must know who needs calming, who responds badly to criticism, who can be trusted with what, who is likely to hold a grudge, when humour can diffuse tension and when it will make things worse, when generosity is politically wise, when firmness is necessary, and when a disagreement threatens the group enough to require some more formal response. None of this appears in the ground as a dramatic invention, but without it, the group frays. Human beings survive not just because they make tools, but because they make relationships workable, often enough for survival to continue. And this is where early humans were likely far more sophisticated than crude stereotypes allow. A society does not need written law to have rules. It does not need a palace to have hierarchy or influence. It does not need a priesthood to have ritual authority. It does not need schools to educate children. Much of human social life can be managed through custom, memory, repeated interaction, and reputation. In small bands, reputation would have mattered enormously. Who shares fairly, who panics badly, who lies, who boasts, who keeps their promises, who is skilled, who is reckless, who is generous, who becomes dangerous when angry. A person's social identity would be built from countless remembered interactions. Keeping that system coherent is not intellectually simple. It is one of the most demanding things humans do. Then there is adaptation across environments, which is perhaps the clearest evidence of the species' hidden brilliance. Over time, humans spread into an extraordinary range of habitats. Coasts, grasslands, forests, deserts, highlands, colder regions, river valleys, each demanded different strategies. There was no single human skill set that automatically solved them all. People had to learn local conditions, develop different techniques, and alter social and material habits accordingly. That required flexibility, and flexibility is one of the highest forms of intelligence because it means not only doing something well, but changing what well even means from place to place. A species that can move into new environments successfully without waiting for major biological changes is doing something unusual. It is relying on culture as an adaptive system. Clothing, shelter, fire use, food processing, movement patterns, group cooperation, local ecological knowledge. All of this allows human beings to respond faster than genes alone can manage. That does not happen by accident. It requires observation, experiment, retention, teaching, and the willingness to alter inherited practices when conditions demand it. In other words, it requires intelligence operating collectively through culture. This is why it is so misleading to talk about early humans as though they were just surviving, with the implication that survival is a sort of dull baseline beneath real achievement. Survival, under prehistoric conditions, was a profound achievement. It demanded technical ability, social coordination, and mental flexibility all at once. An ordinary competent adult in a foraging society may have possessed a body of practical, environmental, and social knowledge so extensive that a modern urban person would struggle even to grasp its full range. We flatter ourselves because our technologies are more visible, but visibility is not the same as competence. It is probably also true that many early humans were capable of thought far beyond what their daily conditions allowed them to express materially. This matters. The human brain does not only solve immediate physical problems, it wanders, imagines, compares, tells stories, notices patterns, and asks why. Even in hard conditions, people reflect. They speculate. They joke. They create explanations for what surrounds them. They develop rituals around death, stories around origin, taboos around danger, meanings around landscape, and social fictions that allow cooperation at larger scales than kinship alone might support. We do not know the exact content of those thoughts, of course, and it would be foolish to invent them too confidently. But the evidence of symbolic behaviour, social complexity, and adaptive success makes one thing very hard to deny. These were minds capable of abstraction, metaphor, and imagination, and perhaps that should not surprise us. Humans are not machines that produce philosophy only after inventing permanent housing. Reflection likely existed wherever language, memory, and social life were rich enough to support it. A person sitting by a fire in the late Pleistocene may have wondered about death, luck, weather, ancestors, justice, and the strange difference between dreams and waking life just as naturally as any later philosopher, only without the benefit of a publishing contract. The hidden brilliance of early humans includes not just their practical skill, but the interior richness that must have accompanied it, even if almost none of it can be excavated directly. There is something humbling in all this. We tend to reserve admiration for moments when intelligence transforms the world in obvious ways. But much of the greatest human intelligence has always been used not to dominate the world spectacularly, but to inhabit it carefully, to notice, to remember, to cooperate, to repair, to teach, to improvise, to keep a fragile social and material world from falling apart. Early humans did this for immense stretches of time under pressures that would expose the weakness of any mind not equal to the task. The fact that they succeeded often enough to carry the species forward is itself evidence of extraordinary capability. At the same time, hidden brilliance remained partly hidden because the world was not yet arranged to amplify it. Intelligence existed, but scale was limited. Skill existed, but storage was fragile. Symbolic thought existed, but institutions were small. Social coordination existed, but populations were thin. The species had the raw powers for much of what would come later, but those powers were still mostly embedded in living communities rather than in permanent systems. Their brilliance illuminated the immediate world around them without yet igniting the long chain reaction of cumulative acceleration. Still, the pieces were gathering, not all at once, and not in one place, but gradually. Better social learning, better transmission, better symbolic worlds, better control over key human tools that were not merely objects, but entire cultural forces. And some of those forces would prove so important that it becomes impossible to tell the story of human acceleration without them. Because once you start asking what early humans were doing brilliantly beneath the surface of apparent slowness, you soon run into a small set of powers that changed everything they touched. Fire that extended the day and transformed food, language that turned memory into a shared instrument, and myth that bound people to meanings larger than any one life. At some point in this long human story, a few forces began to matter so much that it becomes almost impossible to explain our species without them. Not because they arrived all at once in a tidy bundle, and certainly not because one dramatic inventor stood up in the moonlight and announced that civilization would now be proceeding ahead of schedule. It was slower than that, more uneven, more human. But over immense stretches of time, four things kept strengthening the strange advantage our species already had: fire, language, memory, and myth. None of them was a city. None of them was a machine. None of them looked, on its own, like the start of rapid progress. But together they changed what a human group could do, what it could remember, what it could teach, and what it could believe in together. And once those capacities begin to deepen, even a slow world starts preparing for acceleration. Fire is the easiest place to begin because it is both ordinary and almost absurdly important. We know it so well now that it is hard to feel its power properly. It lives in stoves, engines, furnaces, light bulbs by distant ancestry, and in the deep industrial metabolism of the modern world. But for early humans, controlled fire was one of the great turning points in what it meant to survive. It gave warmth in cold places. It gave light after sunset. It offered protection from predators. It changed food. It changed time. And perhaps most important of all, it changed social life. Food first, because the practical consequences were enormous. Cooking transforms what a body can get from the world. It softens tough fibres, kills some pathogens, neutralises at least some dangers, and makes more calories available from many foods. That sounds technical, but its effects are deeply human. More usable energy means less strain on teeth and guts, less chewing, less time spent wrestling with raw toughness, and more nourishment from the same basic ingredients. It also widens the range of what can be eaten safely or comfortably. In a difficult environment that matters, a species that can alter food before swallowing it has gained a remarkable advantage. It is no longer consuming the world only on nature's terms. It is beginning, in a modest and smoky way, to reorganize the world for itself. Warmth is just as important. Fire allows bodies to endure places that might otherwise be dangerous or impossible, especially at night and in colder climates. The day no longer ends so absolutely when the sun disappears. A lit camp is not merely a practical convenience, it is an extension of human control into a time of day once dominated by darkness, uncertainty, and whatever in the bushes had been waiting with unpleasant intent. Fire makes a zone, a little island of visibility and relative safety, and once humans can reliably create such zones, they can do something that turns out to matter tremendously. They can gather around them. That evening gathering may have been one of the most important social institutions in all of prehistory. Though naturally it never appointed a committee or produced minutes, fire creates a centre. People sit near it. They eat near it. They repair tools near it. They watch children near it. They tell stories near it. They argue, explain, tease, boast, teach, and remember near it. It is very difficult to overstate how significant that is. A fire extends the usable day into hours that are less dominated by immediate subsistence tasks. It creates conditions for attention to become collective. Not all the time, not magically, and not without someone still needing to fetch fuel and make sure sparks do not become a more ambitious architectural statement than anyone intended, but enough to matter. And this is where fire and language begin to intertwine. Because language is not just a way of making noises with intent behind them, it is a storage and transmission system. It allows experience to become shareable. Once a group can explain rather than merely demonstrate, human learning changes speed. Not instantly, not infinitely, but decisively. You no longer need every person to rediscover every danger alone. You can warn. You can compare outcomes. You can describe an animal before a child has seen it, a route before someone has walked it, a mistake before it is repeated. You can coordinate more precisely, negotiate more subtly, and preserve more than one person's immediate experience inside the shared mind of the group. This is one reason language is so revolutionary while leaving almost nothing in the ground. Stone survives. Sentences do not. Yet language may have done more than any early tool to enlarge the human future. With language, skill can be broken into steps. Plans can be made jointly. Rules can be stated. Memories can be shaped into narratives that carry not just facts but meanings. Social relationships become more elaborate because intentions, obligations, and identities can be discussed rather than merely inferred. The dead can be remembered in words. Absent people can be talked about. Tomorrow can be prepared for in sentences today. The group becomes more than a collection of reacting bodies. It becomes a coordinated interpretive system. There is also something else language does that is easy to miss. It allows correction. One person says what happened. Another says, no, not quite. The herd turned earlier than that. A third adds that the wind changed. A fourth remembers what happened in the previous dry season. Slowly, through ordinary conversation, experience is not just shared but refined. This may not look grand enough to put on a monument, but it is one of the engines of cumulative culture. A world described together can become a world understood a little better together. Language also transforms childhood. Human children take years to become competent adults, and that long dependence is often treated as a burden, which of course it is for anyone who has ever tried to explain the same obvious thing to a 5-year-old 6 times before lunch. But it is also an opportunity. A long childhood allows for immense cultural loading. Skills, rules, categories, stories, taboos, place knowledge, kinship, practical judgment. All of this can be taught slowly and socially. Language makes that teaching far more efficient. A child can be told not only what to do, but why. Not only where not to step, but what happened to someone who did. Not only the name of a plant, but the season in which it matters and the danger of mistaking it for another. The amount of information that can be packed into a young mind through repeated speech, demonstration and correction is extraordinary. But language alone is not enough. Words vanish if they are not remembered, and this brings us to memory, which for most of human history was not a private mental convenience, but a civilizational necessity. Before writing, memory was infrastructure. It held roots, techniques, names, obligations, stories, warnings, and group identity together. A society without external storage has to make memory work very hard indeed, and humans, being humans, appear to have become extremely good at embedding memory in forms that travel well through the mind. Repetition, story, rhythm, ritual, place, gesture, social reinforcement, emotional significance. All of these help information stick. This is one reason oral cultures are often so much richer and more disciplined than literate societies imagine. When memory matters directly to survival and continuity, it is cultivated. Knowledge is not just possessed. It is rehearsed, enacted, tied to events and places, distributed across persons and generations. A route may be remembered through landmarks and story. A taboo may preserve a hazard. A ritual sequence may reinforce identity and obligation. A genealogy may do more than name ancestors. It may organize marriage, alliance, inheritance of role, or rites of movement. In other words, memory is not merely about the past. It is one of the main tools by which a group stabilizes the present. The evening fire likely strengthened this further. Stories told repeatedly in a shared place become more than entertainment. They become structured memory. A tale about a foolish hunter may preserve a tactical lesson. A story about a dangerous valley may encode ecological warning. An account of ancestors may define who belongs and what is expected of them. Humour helps too, because humans are unusually good at remembering things attached to emotion, and gentle ridicule may have been one of the earliest and most efficient teaching devices ever invented. Nothing fixes a lesson in the mind quite like everyone laughing when you make the same avoidable mistake your uncle was specifically trying to warn you about. And from there we move naturally into myth, which modern people often misunderstand because the word sounds like false story, when in human societies myth is usually doing much heavier work than that. Myth is not merely an error about the world. It is a framework for meaning, memory, obligation, and belonging. It explains where a people came from, why rules matter, what places are special, who the ancestors were, which forces must be respected, what dangers lie beyond ordinary sight, what deaths mean, why suffering happens, why a group should hold together, and what kind of behaviour makes someone properly human in the eyes of others. Myth is social technology. That phrase may sound too cold for something many people hold sacred, but the point is not to reduce myth to manipulation. The point is to recognise its practical force. Human groups can cooperate on a much larger and more stable scale when they share stories that make cooperation meaningful. Kinship is partly biological, of course, but it is also narrated. Territory is partly physical, but it is also storied. Ritual is partly action, but it is also explanation. Myth binds these together. It turns a cluster of people into a community with depth. It gives the group a past larger than living memory and a structure for interpreting the future. This matters enormously in small bands and growing networks alike. A group that believes certain obligations come from ancestors, spirits, or sacred order may hold together more strongly than one relying only on immediate convenience. Shared stories can create trust among people who are not in daily intimate contact. They can justify exchange, marriage rules, conflict settlement, and seasonal gatherings. They can make sacrifice bearable by placing it inside a larger frame. They can also naturally create exclusion, suspicion, and hostility toward outsiders, because every human advantage has a habit of arriving with an invoice. But in terms of long-term cultural accumulation, myth is one of the ways humans learn to organise themselves around invisible things, and invisible things, once collectively believed, become astonishingly powerful. If this all sounds slightly less romantic than the word myth usually permits, that is only because it was so practical. Imagine trying to maintain a complex social world without writing, police, maps, schools, or formal law. You would need memory reinforced by narrative. You would need rules embodied in ritual. You would need identity anchored in stories bigger than current moods. You would need children to absorb not just techniques but meanings. Myth does all of this. It is not a decorative fringe on human life. For most of history, it is one of the main methods by which human life becomes coherent. And once fire, language, memory, and myth begin reinforcing one another, something important happens. Human groups become better at holding on to complexity. Fire creates shared space and time for teaching. Language makes teaching more precise. Memory preserves what language carries. Myth gives memory emotional, social, and moral structure. The result is not sudden civilization, but a species increasingly capable of accumulating culture in ways other animals cannot match. Not perfectly, not uniformly. Good ideas still disappear, groups still fracture, environments still shift. But the underlying machinery of cumulative culture becomes stronger. We can even think of these four powers as a kind of early operating system for humanity. Fire reorganized the day and the diet. Language reorganized communication and coordination. Memory reorganized continuity across generations. Myth reorganized cooperation around shared meaning. None of these required cities, and yet every city that would later rise stood indirectly on their foundation. Long before writing, humans had already developed ways of storing information in minds, practices, places, and stories. Long before states, they had ways of making many people behave as if they belonged to a common moral world. Long before formal education, they had systems for transmitting astonishingly detailed knowledge from old to young. There is a temptation at this point to imagine the deep past becoming steadily brighter, one good invention after another, each clicking cleanly into place. Real history was not nearly so tidy. Control of fire likely varied. Language evolved over long spans and left no neat date. Memory systems depended on social continuity that could always be disrupted. Myths changed, split, merged, and travelled. Different groups would have had different combinations of these strengths at different times. Some may have built rich oral worlds and wide symbolic networks. Others may have remained more local and fragile. The point is not that humanity acquired four superpowers and began marching confidently toward urban planning. The point is that these capacities gradually deepened the species' ability to retain and coordinate culture. It is also worth noticing how deeply these powers remain with us even now. We still gather around controlled light in the evening and tell stories. We still rely on language to coordinate realities we cannot touch. We still build memory through repetition, ceremony, and emotionally charged narrative. We still live inside myths, though we prefer to call modern ones by more respectable names like national identity, progress, destiny, market confidence, and strategic vision. Humans have never stopped being the kind of creatures who survive by combining practical skill with shared imagination. The deep past did not disappear. It simply became layered beneath newer institutions. And beneath all this is a simple but crucial point. These developments did not yet make progress fast. They made progress possible. They allowed useful knowledge to travel further than one body. They allowed groups to stay coherent for longer. They allowed children to inherit more than instinct. They allowed memory to become communal and obligations to become sacred. In a world where survival still consumed most energy and loss remained common, that was already a profound shift. It meant that human life was no longer merely happening. It was beginning, slowly, to accumulate. Once accumulation starts to matter, even in scattered and fragile ways, the next question becomes unavoidable. What happens when enough of these small gains stop vanishing and begin to stack? What changes when knowledge is not just created and remembered within one band, but carried across wider networks, improved by more people, and held long enough for one generation to start slightly ahead of the last? Because that is the quiet threshold this story has been moving toward all along, the moment when culture becomes a little less perishable and a little more cumulative, and history, after ages of walking, begins to discover how to gather speed. For a very long time, human knowledge behaved like water carried in cupped hands. Enough could be held to survive, enough could be passed from one person to another, enough could even travel some distance if people were careful, but loss was built into the system. Spillage was normal. A death, a migration, a broken network, a hard season, a generation that did not have time to learn properly, and some part of the shared world slipped away. That is why so much of early human history feels slow in retrospect. People were learning all the time, but a great deal of what they learned remained local, fragile, and temporary. Then, slowly, unevenly, and in different places at different times, something began to change. Knowledge did not become immortal, far from it, but it started to survive better. It began to accumulate. This is one of the most important turning points in the whole human story, and it is also one of the least dramatic if you're expecting a trumpet blast. There was no single invention called accumulation, no exact date on which people suddenly realized that ideas would now be stacking neatly into progress. What changed was the surrounding ecology of human life. Population slowly increased in some regions. Networks between groups became denser or more regular. Techniques spread farther. Symbolic systems grew richer. Social learning improved. Some groups became less isolated. More minds were exposed to more ideas, and more importantly, those ideas had a slightly better chance of being preserved long enough to be modified by someone else. That last part matters enormously. A useful idea is good. A useful idea that survives, spreads, gets improved, and becomes part of normal practice is something much more powerful. That is cumulative culture, and it may be the nearest thing humans have to a superpower. Other animals learn. Some even teach, imitate, and innovate in modest ways. Humans do something more unstable and more explosive. We inherit not just genes and habits, but increasingly elaborate packages of socially stored knowledge. One generation does not always start from the beginning. If conditions are favourable, it starts a little further on. Not because individuals are smarter, but because culture has remembered more. This is sometimes called the ratchet effect, and it is a useful image. A ratchet allows movement in one direction while making it harder to slide backward. Human history, for most of its span, had only a weak ratchet. Gains were possible, but reversals were common. Techniques improved, then vanished. Symbolic forms appeared, then thinned. Networks grew, then fractured. As cultural ratcheting became stronger, a new pattern emerged. Useful practices became stickier. Skills were retained with greater fidelity. More people learned them. More specialists could refine them. Ideas could travel farther without being entirely transformed or forgotten. Once that starts happening reliably enough, the pace of visible change begins to increase, even if daily life remains in many ways recognizably ancient. A central reason for this change was demography. More people does not just mean more births, more bodies, and more opportunities for someone to become annoying during group decisions. It means more teachers, more learners, more redundancy, more variation, more chances that a useful innovation will be preserved even if one line of transmission fails. In a tiny population, a demanding skill can disappear because only a few people knew it. In a larger connected population, the same skill can survive because several people know it, several children are learning it, and neighbouring groups can reinforce one another. the cultural world becomes less brittle. This is why population size and connectivity are such quiet but powerful motors of history. We often like to credit change to singular genius because it makes for a cleaner story. One inventor, one prophet, one ruler, one big breakthrough. But much of the time, what matters most is not the lone mind but the network around it. An idea born into a sparse, disconnected world may die there. The same idea born into a denser, better-linked world may spread, combine, and transform. Human progress accelerates not only when people think new thoughts, but when societies become good at keeping thoughts alive long enough to matter. These networks did not have to look anything like roads, empires, or formal trade states to make a difference. Even in deep prehistory, groups could exchange materials, marriage partners, styles, ornaments, stories, and techniques over surprisingly wide regions. A shell from one coast can travel inland. A certain kind of stone can move over long distances. Decorative styles can spread. Tool traditions can influence one another. None of this means there was a neatly managed continental information system with helpful signage and a customer service desk. It means that human groups were often less isolated than we once imagined, and those connections gave knowledge more routes by which to survive. Marriage networks may have been especially important here. When people move between groups, they do not travel empty-handed. They bring practices, preferences, techniques, expectations, stories, and kin ties. Children growing up across linked communities may inherit mixed traditions. Social trust extends beyond one small band. Information about resources, dangers, routes, and customs can travel through these relationships. This kind of exchange is not as visible as writing, but it may have done much of the early work of widening the cultural world. A species becomes cumulative not only because it invents, but because it shares, and sharing itself becomes more effective once communication, symbolism, and memory are strong enough to support it. Language, as we have seen, allows knowledge to be described, corrected, and taught. Memory allows it to be retained across time. Myth and shared identity allow trust to extend beyond immediate convenience. If all these systems deepen together, then a community does not merely react to the present. It starts to carry a thicker inherited past. Children learn not just survival basics, but more specialized practices, more place-based stories, more stable norms. The cultural starting line moves. There is also an important difference between knowing something and being able to teach it reliably. Many early human skills were complex, but not all complex skills are equally transmissible. Some are easy to demonstrate and copy. Others require long practice, subtle judgment, or carefully sequenced instruction. As human communities became better at teaching, some difficult skills likely became more stable. That does not require schools in the formal sense. It requires repeated demonstration, patient correction, shared vocabulary, and social structures in which learners can spend enough time with skilled adults. In a denser, more connected cultural environment, the odds improve that the hard stuff survives. The same applies to tools. A tool is never just an object. It is a relationship between materials, knowledge, use, and maintenance. Once tool traditions begin to accumulate rather than merely recur, the difference becomes significant. You no longer have only one clever person occasionally producing something excellent. You have a tradition in which multiple people recognize what good looks like, can teach it, and can improve upon it. Standardization begins to appear, not in the modern industrial sense, but in the sense that methods become recognizable across a wider population. This matters because standardization is one form of memory. It means the community carries expectations about how things are made. At this point, the human world is still far from cities, but it is no longer quite the same world of endlessly resetting local survival. More activities begin to have a history. A method used this year has a remembered version from earlier years. One group compares its style with another. A tool shape can be judged against known alternatives. Ornament can carry signals not only of identity but of wider cultural connection. exchange can create obligations that persist over time. A social world with broader memory is beginning to emerge, and broader memory is what allows improvement to stop disappearing quite so easily. Climate may also have played a role, though carefully and differently across regions. Toward the end of the Pleistocene and into the early Holocene, some areas experienced environmental conditions that were more stable, or at least more predictable than many of the dramatic swings of earlier ages. Predictability does not solve everything, and it certainly does not make life easy, but it changes how far ahead people can plan. If seasonal resources become more reliable in a region, if wild grains or fish runs or herd patterns can be anticipated with some confidence, then groups may return to the same places more often, remain longer, invest more in local knowledge, and build stronger routines around recurring abundance. Repetition in place can strengthen accumulation. This is one reason that semi-sedentary life matters even before full agriculture appears. Some human communities, especially in resource-rich zones, could become less mobile without yet farming in the full later sense. Coastal environments, river valleys, and other productive landscapes sometimes allowed people to return seasonally or remain for longer periods. Once groups spend more time in one place, certain things become easier. Storage becomes more worthwhile. Heavier tools make more sense. Built structures become more attractive. Social groups can become larger or more stable at particular sites. Teaching can be concentrated. Exchange can happen more regularly. Memory becomes attached not only to persons but to places repeatedly occupied by many people. Place attachment is itself a form of cultural deepening. A camp visited once is a stop. A place revisited across generations becomes a node in a cultural landscape. It gathers stories, burials, rituals, roots, obligations, rites, and remembered events. When communities begin to anchor more of their identity in recurring places, knowledge has more scaffolding. People do not merely inherit techniques, they inherit a world structured by meaningful locations. That makes transmission stronger because the past can be recalled through movement across a familiar landscape. This hill, that river crossing, the sheltering overhang, the stand of trees where certain things are done or never done. Memory and geography start to reinforce one another more heavily. Then there is storage, one of the least glamorous and most revolutionary developments in human life. Before large-scale surpluses, storage remains limited, but even modest improvements in preserving food, keeping tools, or maintaining seasonal resources can have cultural consequences. Stored things reduce immediate pressure. Reduced pressure creates a little spare time or a little greater resilience. That tiny margin can make the difference between losing a skill and teaching it properly, between abandoning a promising practice and sustaining it. Human acceleration is often powered not by grandeur but by margins. A little more predictability, a little more redundancy, a little less risk, and suddenly more knowledge survives. This is why it is misleading to think of accumulation as purely intellectual. It is ecological and social as much as mental. You need enough food to support learners, enough stability to maintain traditions, enough contact for ideas to circulate, enough trust for teaching to happen across generations, enough repetition for memory to become reliable. Culture does not pile up in the abstract. It piles up in bodies that are fed, in children who live long enough to learn, in elders who survive long enough to teach, and in communities stable enough to care what happened last year. Once all that begins to hold, a strange thing happens. Time itself changes character. In a fragile survival world, each generation may inherit some things, but much effort still goes toward holding on to what already exists. In an accumulating world, the inherited base grows. That means children do not simply learn how to endure. They learn how things are done now, which may already embody many previous generations of refinement. The everyday baseline becomes more sophisticated without any one person necessarily noticing how extraordinary it is. Culture becomes thick enough that ordinary life already contains stored intelligence from long before your birth. This is true even in modern life. Most people use tools, words, customs, and techniques whose histories they do not know. A child learns a language that no individual invented. A craftsperson inherits methods refined by countless unnamed predecessors. A community follows rituals, recipes, or social norms that long predate anyone currently living. Once culture accumulates strongly enough, inheritance becomes almost invisible. That invisibility is a sign of success. The knowledge is no longer precarious novelty. It has become normal. In later periods, writing will amplify this enormously, but accumulation begins before writing. It begins when oral traditions become richer, when exchange becomes wider, when skilled practices become more faithfully transmitted, when material culture shows persistent refinement rather than isolated brilliance, when social networks are strong enough that one group's advantage can survive beyond one group. The deep human past contains many thresholds like this, modest by modern standards, profound by prehistoric ones, not the invention of civilization, but the strengthening of continuity. This also helps explain why some late prehistoric societies appear suddenly more complex to us. They are not necessarily becoming intelligent all at once. They are benefiting from cultural worlds that have crossed a retention threshold. Enough knowledge is sticking. Enough people are carrying it. Enough connections are reinforcing it. Enough repeated practices are no longer vanishing between generations. What looks like sudden blossoming may really be the visible surface of long invisible accumulation finally becoming hard to miss. One could almost say that humanity spent an immense stretch of time learning how not to forget. Not perfectly, not universally, and not without setbacks, but increasingly well. Fire extended teaching time. Language made teaching precise. Memory kept knowledge in circulation. Myth structured obligation and meaning. Demography gave ideas more carriers. Exchange widened their reach. Repeated occupation of place strengthened continuity. Small surpluses reduced the danger of total reset. Slowly the ratchet tightened. A good idea no longer vanished quite as easily as before, and once that happens, change starts to feed on itself. Better transmission leads to better tools. Better tools support more reliable food gathering or processing. More reliable food supports larger or more stable groups. Larger groups support more varied skills and stronger exchange. Stronger exchange supports broader cultural repertoires. Broader repertoires create more opportunities for recombination. Recombination produces further improvements. It is still not the modern world, not even close, but now the logic of acceleration is faintly visible. Human life begins to generate positive feedback. Positive feedback does not mean smooth progress. There are still collapses, dead ends, losses and reversals. Entire traditions can still vanish. Regions can still empty or fragment. Environmental pressures still matter enormously, but the balance is changing. Cumulative gains begin to outcompete total resets more often. History is learning, very slowly, how to keep its own notes. It is tempting at this stage to imagine an inevitable march toward agriculture, as though once knowledge starts accumulating, farming becomes the obvious next chapter in the human manual. But history is rarely that obedient. Many groups remained foragers by choice or circumstance for very long periods, and often successfully. Still, once humans become good enough at remembering landscapes, seasons, plant life, and social coordination, a new possibility emerges in some places. Not because people suddenly become more human, and not because foraging had been some embarrassing delay, but because accumulated knowledge eventually makes certain experiments more thinkable, more manageable, and more worth trying. If culture can now hold on to enough detail about recurring resources, if communities are somewhat larger, if certain places are revisited again and again, if storage and planning have improved, then the boundary between gathering what nature offers and beginning to shape what nature produces starts to look a little less absolute. And once that boundary begins to soften, human history enters a very different kind of motion. Not a single leap, not a universal decision, and certainly not one tidy morning when humanity collectively looked at wild grass and thought, yes, this seems like paperwork. Farming emerged gradually, unevenly, and in several parts of the world under different conditions. People did not abandon foraging everywhere at once, and many did not abandon it at all for very long stretches. But where agriculture did take hold, it altered the pace of life in a way that is hard to overstate. It changed what people paid attention to, how long they stayed in one place, how many children they could raise, how much food could be stored, how much labour could be directed beyond immediate subsistence, and how much knowledge could accumulate without constantly slipping away. It did not instantly make life easier, and in many cases it made it harsher, dirtier, more unequal, and more exhausting. But it changed the speed of everything. For most of human existence, the natural world was something to be followed closely. You learned its rhythms, moved with them, took advantage of them, and tried not to be crushed by them. Even when foragers managed environments in sophisticated ways, through burning, selective harvesting, seasonal return, or careful ecological knowledge, their lives were still largely organised around what nature offered where and when. Agriculture changed that relationship. It did not free humans from nature, not remotely. If anything, it tied them more tightly to soil, rain, seasonality, pests, and climate than ever before. But it did introduce a new ambition. Instead of only finding food, people in some places began to shape the conditions under which food would appear. That shift sounds simple until you think about what it demands. To farm successfully, even at an early level, you need repeated observation over long periods. You need to know what grows where, what happens if seeds are dropped or planted, what soils hold moisture, what river patterns help and harm, which plants are worth the trouble, which mature reliably, which can be stored, and which animals can be managed rather than merely hunted. None of this would have emerged from ignorance. It required exactly the sort of accumulated ecological knowledge that humans had been building for ages. Farming was not a sudden contradiction of the foraging world. It was partly an outgrowth of it. The people who first cultivated plants were not leaving nature behind. They were applying deep familiarity with it in a more interventionist way. An intervention changes tempo because it changes commitment. A foraging group can move if conditions worsen. A cultivating group has begun to invest in a particular place. Once you clear land, plant seed, tend crops, protect them from animals, watch their growth, and wait for harvest. You're no longer simply following opportunity. You are creating a cycle that ties labour now to reward later. Human time becomes more delayed, more scheduled, more disciplined by expected return. There are planting seasons, weeding periods, harvest moments, storage concerns, future calculations. The land becomes not just a setting, but a project. This does not mean early farmers instantly became settled villagers with attractive pottery and a charming sense of civic identity. The transition was often partial, mixed, and slow. Many communities combined foraging with cultivation for long periods. Some experimented and retreated. Some kept moving seasonally while tending specific resources. Others focused on a few domesticates without fully reorganizing life around them. But even modest cultivation begins to favor different habits. From a purely mobile foraging life, you return to the same place more often. You invest more in structures. You store more. You remain long enough for possessions to accumulate and for local knowledge to thicken into something more fixed. And storage is one of the great accelerants of history. Once food can be stored in meaningful quantities, the relationship between people and time changes. A stored surplus is more than calories. It is deferred security. It is insurance against short-term scarcity. It is the possibility of surviving a poor season. It is also, crucially, the possibility that not every able adult must spend every day engaged in immediate food procurement. That does not happen all at once, and early agricultural labour could be relentless. But over time, surplus opens room for specialisation, and specialisation is one of the clearest signs that human acceleration has begun to gather force. In a small foraging band, most adults need broad competence. Everyone must remain close to the practical business of living. In a settled farming society with larger populations and more stored food, some people can begin to do other things more consistently. Not because farming magically creates leisure for all, quite the opposite in many cases, but because it creates enough concentration of food and people for certain roles to become more stable. Potters can refine pottery because grain must be stored. Builders can improve structures because people remain in one place. Ritual specialists can become more central because larger settled communities need stronger symbolic cohesion. Traders can move goods between places where production differs. Organisers, counters, and eventually administrators begin to matter because once food and labour accumulate, someone always decides it would be useful to keep track of them. And once that happens, the human future acquires a dangerous taste for lists. Population is another part of the story, and here farming may have changed speed more brutally than anything else. Foragers often live at low population densities not because they are incapable of producing children, but because mobility, breastfeeding patterns, workload, and ecological limits keep growth constrained. Settled food production can shift those constraints. If food can be produced in greater quantities per unit of land, if children can be weaned earlier because soft grains or animal milk become available, if mothers do not need to carry each child over long distances as often, then birth rates can rise. More children survive. More people live near one another. Villages form. Villages expand. And once human beings begin living in larger, denser communities, the dynamics of change alter dramatically. More people means more labour, but it also means more minds, more exchange, more opportunities for skills to persist, more chances for innovation to be retained and improved. This is the same logic we have already seen in smaller form, but agriculture intensifies it. A farming village can hold many more people in one place than a mobile foraging camp of similar territory use. That density creates problems, many of them unpleasant, but it also creates cultural momentum. Children grow up surrounded by more adults, more skills, more objects, more repeated practices. Information does not have to travel as far to find another mind. Techniques spread more easily, standards emerge, social memory thickens. The irony, of course, is that farming did not necessarily make individual lives healthier or happier in the short term. In many early agricultural societies, diets became narrower. Heavy dependence on a few staple crops could reduce nutritional diversity compared with successful foraging. Settled communities living close to animals and close to one another faced more infectious disease. Labour often became repetitive, seasonal, and punishing. Skeletons from some early farming populations suggest harder physical strain, poorer dental health, and signs of malnutrition compared with earlier foragers in some regions. So when we say farming changed the speed of everything, we should not imagine that it arrived as a gift basket of prosperity and emotional fulfillment. It accelerated history, yes, but history is not always kind to the people doing the accelerating. Still, speed changed because agriculture created feedback loops unlike anything that had existed before on the same scale. More reliable food production supported larger populations. Larger populations supported greater labour capacity and more sustained exchange. Greater exchange spread tools, seeds, animals, and ideas. Larger settlements justified stronger storage systems, more durable architecture, and more formal roles. Those formal roles improved organisation, which supported still more production and still more concentration. Once these loops begin, cumulative change becomes much harder to slow down. Human societies start becoming engines that produce more society. Property also begins to matter differently. In a mobile foraging life, personal possessions are constrained by what can be carried and by the logic of sharing within a small group. In a farming world tied to land, fields, stores, structures and herds acquire new importance. Boundaries matter more, inheritance matters more. Labour invested in a place creates claims over that place. Grain stored in a container can be counted, guarded, taxed, stolen, lent, or used to compel others. This is one of the darker accelerants of history. Once people can accumulate surplus materially and spatially, inequality becomes easier to stabilise. Some households gain more land, more animals, more labour power, more political influence. Others become dependent. Farming did not invent inequality, but it often gave inequality heavier furniture, and heavier furniture in historical terms tends to stay put. A hierarchy built on land and stored food is easier to reproduce than one based only on temporary prestige. Families can pass advantage to children. Communities can compel labour for irrigation, storage, walls, ritual centres, or defence. Leaders can emerge who coordinate collective work and then discover, as people often do, that coordination has certain personal attractions when one is standing at the commanding end of it. Social complexity increases, but not always in ways that make life gentler. Farming changes speed partly because it lets societies become larger and more organised, and larger organised societies can do remarkable things. They can also demand remarkable sacrifices from the people at the bottom. Animals complicate the picture further. Domestication was not simply about meat. Animals provided milk, hides, dung for fuel or fertiliser, traction in later contexts, and a mobile store of wealth. Managing herds required new forms of knowledge, movement, disease risk, and social value. Herd animals could turn into status, inheritance, exchange, and conflict. The relationship between humans and non-human life became more structurally integrated. Fields and herds turned landscapes into managed systems. Human time became increasingly occupied by maintenance. Fences, pens, planting, watering, protecting, storing, breeding. It is a more intervention-heavy way of living, and intervention-heavy systems often produce more output at the cost of more constant work and vulnerability to failure. Because failure under agriculture can be terrifying in its own distinct way. A forager facing scarcity may still retain mobility and dietary breadth. A farming population tied heavily to a staple crop can be devastated if that crop fails. Drought, flood, pests, bleat, conflict, exhausted soils, all can turn the surplus machine into a trap. This is one reason early farming should not be romanticised as an obviously superior choice. It produced new possibilities, but also new dependencies. People may work harder for less varied food while becoming more vulnerable to large-scale shortage. Yet despite these costs, agriculture continued to spread in many regions because its demographic and organisational consequences were so powerful. Communities that could support more people could expand, compete, absorb, or displace others. Numbers alone begin to matter historically in a new way. The village is perhaps the clearest visible sign that speed has changed. A village is not just a cluster of houses, it is a social technology. People remain in repeated close contact. Children grow up among fixed structures and shared spaces. Labour can be coordinated seasonally or daily. Goods can be made and exchanged regularly. Ritual can be centralised. The dead may be buried near the living, deepening the sense that this place is not merely used, but owned by memory. Once a community thinks of itself as anchored, its ambitions change. Repair becomes worthwhile. Expansion becomes meaningful. Boundaries become arguable. Neighbours become permanent facts rather than brief encounters. Human life gains inertia. That inertia is vital to cumulative culture. When people remain, objects remain. When objects remain, techniques stabilise around them. When places remain occupied, memory gathers in layers. A wall can be improved. A storehouse can be enlarged. A field can be worked year after year. Children do not just inherit stories and skills, they inherit a built environment embodying earlier effort. A house is already a form of stored labour. A granary is stored labour holding stored food for future labour. A village is history made material on a small scale. Once enough human life exists in that form, change begins to leave behind much thicker traces, both archaeologically and socially. The rhythm of the year also becomes more rigid. Foragers certainly lived by season, but agricultural seasonality imposes a different kind of discipline. Plant too late and yields suffer. Neglect weeding and crops fail. Miss the harvest window and months of labour can be lost. This encourages planning, calendrical awareness, and eventually more formal observation of cycles. When your survival depends on timely action across a whole community, timekeeping gains weight. Not clocks, not yet, but collective attention to sequence, recurrence, and anticipation. The future becomes more administratively important. Human societies begin organising themselves around tasks that must be done at the right time and often together. This is also why ritual often becomes more elaborate in farming societies. It is not merely superstition attaching itself to crops like ivy to a wall. Ritual helps coordinate people, reduce uncertainty, reinforce cooperation, justify hierarchy, and bind a community emotionally to the seasonal work on which it depends. Planting and harvest are not just economic acts. They become communal acts, moral acts, sacred acts. That matters because farming enlarges society while also making it more fragile. Larger settled groups need stronger shared meanings to hold together, especially when labour must be mobilised, resources distributed, and losses endured collectively. And with larger populations, more stored food, more fixed places, more defined roles, and more durable inequality, conflict changes too. People now have more to defend and more to raid. Land matters, harvests matter, herds matter. Storage attracts attention of the unfriendly sort. Settled life can therefore intensify warfare, fortification, and organised violence in some settings. Once again, speed increases, but not benignly. The same systems that allow more accumulation also create more targets. Human history begins to produce larger stakes, and large stakes have a way of making neighbours nervous. Yet despite all this, despite the harder labour, the disease burden, the hierarchy, the conflict, the monotony of repeated tasks, agriculture did something no previous mode of life had done so consistently. It increased the carrying capacity of land in ways that made larger and more enduring human concentrations possible. More people, more goods, more obligations, more memory, more pressure, more innovation, more danger, more coordination. Everything begins to scale. That is why farming changed speed. It did not simply add one more technique to the human toolkit. It restructured the conditions under which almost every other human activity took place. In a foraging world, progress could accumulate, but slowly and with frequent leakage. In a farming world, enough surplus and stability can exist for accumulation to become self-reinforcing. Better tools improve farming. Improved farming supports more people. More people support more specialization. Specialization improves tools, storage, construction, and exchange. Exchange widens networks. Wider networks bring in new crops, new materials, new practices. All of it compounds. Not every year, not everywhere, and not without reversals, but the logic is unmistakable. Human societies have discovered an accelerator pedal, even if they have not yet learned where the brakes might be. This is also the point where simple local memory begins straining against its own limits. Once villages become larger, surpluses bigger, exchanges wider, obligations more complex, and inequalities more structured, remembering everything through speech, habit, and personal reputation alone becomes harder. Who owes grain? Who controls which field? Which household contributed labour? Which store belongs to whom? What was promised, traded, inherited, or sacrificed? Oral memory can do a great deal, but agriculture creates worlds dense enough that the pressure for external record-keeping begins to build. the village is becoming something larger than face-to-face recollection can always manage. So farming did not merely speed up food production, it sped up social complexity, it sped up demography, it sped up inequality, it sped up the accumulation of objects, labour, claims, roles, and tensions. It deepened the human relationship with place and future time. It thickened memory into structures and stores. It gave history a heavier body and a faster pulse. And once enough, people are living in permanent settlements, raising crops, storing surpluses, defending territory, and organising labour beyond the household. Another threshold comes into view almost inevitably. Because the next step is not just more farming, it is the appearance of systems built to manage the world's farming created, systems of counting, writing, administration and urban life, where knowledge no longer simply accumulates in villages and seasons, but begins to be fixed in marks, institutions and cities. Once farming had created larger, denser, more settled human worlds, a new problem appeared almost immediately. In some ways, it was a luxurious problem, which is to say a problem caused by having more than earlier societies had. More food, more people, more labour, more objects, more claims, more obligations, more memory to keep straight. But luxurious problems are still problems, and human beings have a well-established habit of solving one difficulty by building three larger ones around it. The village, once it grows beyond the intimate scale of personal memory and face-to-face trust, begins to strain. It becomes harder to remember who owes what, who controls which field, how much grain was stored, what was promised in exchange, which family contributed labour, which offerings are due, which boundaries were agreed, and how the work of many hands is to be coordinated without the entire arrangement dissolving into accusation by sunset. This is the point at which human societies begin inventing not just better tools for surviving in the world, but better tools for managing each other. That change matters because management, dull though the word may sound, is one of the great accelerants of history. Once human communities become large enough, the main barrier to further growth is no longer only food, it is information. Who belongs, who contributes, who commands, who stores, who distributes, who remembers. In small bands and even modest villages, much of that can remain personal. People know one another, reputation carries weight, memory is enough. But once settlements expand and surplus accumulates, memory alone starts to wobble under the strain. Oral culture can preserve astonishing amounts, as we have seen, but it is less well suited to the endless small bookkeeping of increasingly complex societies. At some point, somebody wants to know exactly how many sacks of grain there are, and roughly a satisfying number stops being an acceptable administrative answer. So record-keeping begins to emerge, and with it one of the most profound shifts in the whole human story. Writing did not first appear because people were desperate to compose philosophical reflections about existence, however noble that would sound in retrospect. It seems to have emerged in close connection with accounting, administration, storage, and exchange. That may feel slightly disappointing to anyone hoping civilization began with poetry under the stars, but it is also wonderfully human. Faced with the complexity created by surplus agriculture and settled life, people started making marks that could stand in for memory. A debt, a measure, a person, a place, a quantity, an obligation. At first these signs were limited, practical, and tied closely to institutions. But once memory escapes the skull and enters durable symbols, a species changes its future. This is the crucial difference. Oral cultures can preserve great bodies of knowledge, but written marks can preserve details with a consistency and portability that oral systems struggle to match, especially in large anonymous societies. Writing allows information to survive the death of individuals more reliably. It allows instructions to travel without the speaker. It allows comparison over time. It allows obligations to be fixed, tax to be assessed, property to be claimed, transactions to be tracked, rulers to issue commands beyond the range of their voice, and administrators to make life more orderly or more oppressive depending on temperament, ideology, and how much access they have to other people's grain. Often both. With writing, human memory acquires an external skeleton. That does not mean memory stops mattering, quite the opposite. Literate societies still depend on memory, ritual, and oral transmission. But the balance shifts. The community no longer relies entirely on living persons to carry every important detail forward. Information can now persist in clay, ink, stone, papyrus, bamboo, parchment, or whatever medium a civilization finds practical enough to write on and inconvenient enough to preserve for the archaeologists of the distant future. Once that happens, culture becomes less fragile in a new way. Not invulnerable, certainly. Libraries burn, tablets break, states collapse, scripts are forgotten. But the basic principle has been established. Knowledge can live outside the body. This changes speed because external memory compounds accumulation. A generation that can consult records does not merely inherit stories and habits. It inherits data, instructions, names, measures, precedents, and formulations that can be revisited and refined. Administration becomes more sophisticated. Trade becomes more scalable. Law becomes more fixed. Religion becomes more systematized. Myth can become scripture. History, or at least something recognizable as a political memory of the past, becomes easier to formalize. The difference is immense. A spoken rule lasts as long as communities keep saying it correctly. A written rule can confront people long after the speaker is gone, which no doubt delighted rulers and tax collectors and pleased everybody else rather less. And writing does not appear in isolation. It arrives in worlds where cities are emerging, and cities are perhaps the clearest visible sign that the human pace has truly changed. A city is not just a large village. It is a new kind of organism. It concentrates people, labour, resources, power, craft, trade, worship, and conflict at a scale earlier societies could rarely sustain. It creates neighbourhoods, institutions, specialization, hierarchy, infrastructure, and anonymity. That last one is especially important. In a village, people mostly know one another. In a city, many do not. The social fabric can no longer rely only on personal familiarity. Systems must take over. Rules must be made more formal. Records matter more. Authority becomes more structured. Public space becomes politically significant. Human life becomes legible to power in new ways, and power becomes capable of acting at new distances. This concentration generates astonishing effects. Craftspeople can specialize deeply because there are enough customers, patrons, or institutions to sustain them. Traders can move goods between regions because urban centers create demand and concentrate wealth. Temples, palaces, and storehouses gather surplus and redistribute it, though not always with admirable fairness. Builders can construct on a scale that exceeds household need. Priests or ritual specialists can become full-time managers of sacred systems. Scribes can emerge as a distinct class because the marks they master are useful to institutions. Soldiers, officials, merchants, artisans, labourers, servants, rulers, all these roles become more sharply differentiated. Society becomes layered. And layering changes history because once people are not all doing broadly similar things for survival, new forms of feedback appear. Specialization increases skill. Skilled specialists improve tools, buildings, transport, administration, and production. Improved production supports more specialists. More specialists create more complex institutions. More complex institutions gather more resources and coordinate more labour. Larger coordinated systems can build canals, walls, roads, granaries, workshops, and monumental structures. Those structures in turn support denser populations, stronger trade, and wider influence. The city becomes an engine for concentrating and multiplying human effort. This is why the first great acceleration is not merely about invention in the narrow technological sense. It is about scale. A city can make modest innovations matter much more because it can absorb them, distribute them, and build institutions around them. A better plough, a better irrigation system, a better accounting method, a better transport container, a better standard for weights and measures. These may sound less glamorous than the later myth of lone genius, but in aggregate they are transformative. Standardization especially becomes a powerful force. When measures are shared, trade becomes easier. When script is taught, administration becomes more reliable. When laws are codified, at least in theory, authority becomes more predictable. When labour can be organised across large populations, construction and agriculture can operate on scales no band or village could manage. Irrigation is a good example of how urban and administrative life begin to intensify everything. In regions where water can be directed, stored, and channeled, agriculture becomes more productive, but only if people coordinate. Channels must be dug, maintained, defended, and allocated. Floods must be managed. Labour must be mobilised at the right times. That demands planning, authority, and records. In return, it produces larger surpluses. Larger surpluses support larger cities. Larger cities require more administration, more storage, and more transport. The whole system ratchets upward. It is powerful, but it is also fragile in its own way. A failed river, neglected canal, or collapsing state can damage the machinery badly. Still, while it works, the pace of social change increases sharply. Trade expands this even further. Cities rarely live on local food alone, especially as they grow. They need hinterlands. They need exchange networks. Grain, livestock, stone, timber, metals, pottery, textiles, oils, dyes, and prestige goods move between regions. This movement matters not only because objects travel, but because ideas travel with them. Scripts influence one another, technologies spread, artistic styles diffuse, religious concepts mingle. Merchants, migrants, captives, administrators, and itinerant specialists all become carriers of culture. A city connected to many roots becomes a kind of amplifier. It receives, transforms, and redistributes not only material goods, but techniques and institutions. Once that happens, civilization begins producing visible history in the form we now recognize most readily. Names of rulers, dates of reigns, recorded laws, tax registers, administrative archives, epic traditions written down, monuments with inscriptions, treaties, letters, complaints, lists, endless lists, because no civilization in possession of writing has ever entirely resisted the urge to make a list. The important point is that the pace becomes trackable. Earlier human life certainly changed, but much of that change disappeared into the thin record of deep time. With cities and writing, change starts leaving a denser paper trail, or clay trail, or stone trail, depending on what the local bureaucracy found cost-effective. This also alters how societies think about themselves. A city with writing can remember its own past more explicitly. It can preserve lineages, victories, religious traditions, and legal precedents beyond living memory. It can construct official narratives. It can tell itself what kind of place it is, and who has the right to rule it. In that sense, writing does not merely store information, it stores legitimacy. Kingship becomes more durable when it can be recorded. Temples become more authoritative when rituals are formalized. Property becomes more rigid when boundaries and claims are fixed in documents. History itself becomes a political tool. There is naturally a cost. Once systems become formal, they also become capable of exploitation on a larger scale. Bureaucracy can coordinate irrigation and grain storage, but it can also extract labour and tax with exhausting efficiency. Cities create opportunities, but they also create crowding, inequality, and vulnerability to disease. Surplus supports specialists, but it also supports elites who live very comfortably off the work of others while producing noble speeches about order. Written law can stabilise disputes, but it can also lock injustice into durable form. Every acceleration in human organisation seems to come paired with new methods for concentrating power, which is perhaps the most reliable pattern in history and one of the least charming. Even so, the effects on cumulative culture are immense. Once records exist, learning no longer depends entirely on repeated oral transfer. A scribe can copy a text. An administrator can compare this year's yield with a previous one. A ruler can send the same order to several places. A religious tradition can preserve complex liturgy more consistently. Mathematical procedures can be taught with greater precision. Astronomical observations can be accumulated. Calendars can be refined. Architecture can scale because measurement, labour and supply can be coordinated with more confidence. The city becomes a memory machine, and once societies gain memory machines, their capacity for growth increases sharply. It is worth noticing that not all of this is as abstract as it sounds. Writing an urban life change daily experience. A person now lives among strangers and institutions. Food may come through markets or distribution systems rather than direct procurement. Authority appears not only in familiar elders, but in officials, scribes, guards, priests and magistrates. The built environment surrounds life with walls, streets, storage buildings, workshops, shrines, and places designated for administration. The rhythms of labour become more differentiated. Some people work land outside the city, some inside workshops, some in transport, some in service to temple or palace, some in households of varying rank. The division of life becomes more elaborate. Children growing up in such worlds inherit much thicker social environments. They may learn a craft through apprenticeship. They may absorb a formal religion tied to institutions rather than only household ritual. They may hear several languages or dialects in a market. They may see documents used as authority. They may encounter strangers regularly. Their world is no longer a small circle of kin and known neighbours moving through landscape. It is a layered human system. That changes cognition too. Not the underlying human mind, but the sorts of complexity that ordinary people must navigate. Contract, hierarchy, urban etiquette, market exchange, formal property, legal judgment, public ritual, social rank made visible in clothes, space, and access. Civilization trains the mind differently because it gives the mind different problems. This first great acceleration is therefore more than a burst of cleverness. It is the moment when several long building processes lock together. Agriculture has already produced surplus and dense populations. Settlements have become permanent enough to gather institutions. Exchange networks have widened. Writing stabilizes memory. Cities concentrate specialists. Administration coordinates labour. Religion and law give large populations shared frameworks, whether consoling or coercive. The result is a society that can produce more change in a few centuries than earlier eras often did in many millennia, not because individuals have become smarter, but because collective learning has become much more scalable. And once collective learning scales, invention stops being merely local adaptation and begins to become structural. Better boats reshape trade. Better metallurgy reshapes tools, weapons, agriculture and status. Better roads or administrative routes increase integration. Better record-keeping tightens taxation and planning. Better mathematics improves accounting and building. Better military organisation expands states, which in turn spread languages, laws and technologies. The process is not smooth, and collapse remains common. Entire cities can fall, states can fragment, writing systems can disappear. But even collapse now often happens on top of thick layers of stored culture. The world no longer resets so easily. This is one reason later civilizations could rise on the ruins of earlier ones. They inherited fields, roads, irrigation works, myths, scripts, administrative habits, trade routes, and social categories shaped by previous societies. They did not begin from scratch. That is the real mark of acceleration. History has become cumulative enough that even failure leaves scaffolding. A burned archive is a tragedy, but an archive existed. A fallen city may still leave stones, canals, roots, legal concepts and stories for others to reuse. The species has finally become very difficult to reset completely, and from here, the logic of rapid change only grows stronger. Once writing, cities, institutions and stored knowledge are in place, future accelerations become more likely. Empires can connect larger territories, scholars can build on recorded observations, religions can spread through text, trade can move both goods and ideas across continents, technologies can diffuse faster, crises can also spread faster, which humanity will continue to discover with remarkable consistency. But the general direction is clear. The human world has crossed a threshold. It is no longer simply learning how to survive or even how to accumulate. It is learning how to run. Still, that running is not yet the breakneck pace of the modern age. It is the first great acceleration, not the last. The species has moved from slow local adaptation to visibly cumulative civilization. But the deeper question remains waiting just ahead. If anatomically modern humans spent such a vast stretch of time in a world of small groups, fragile memory and gradual change, why did the later centuries and millennia feel so different, so much faster, so increasingly self-reinforcing? Because once history has cities and writing, it has finally built the conditions for a long chain reaction. The old human powers, language, memory, cooperation, symbolism, practical skill, are no longer flickering mostly in isolated communities. They are being connected through institutions that can preserve and multiply them. And when that multiplication gathers enough momentum, history begins to do something it had only hinted at before. It begins not merely to change, but to change faster because it has changed before. By the time writing, cities and administration had taken shape, the old human story had already changed beyond recognition. For most of our existence, progress had been slow because every gain was fragile. Knowledge lived in people, in stories, in habits, in repeated gestures, and in small communities that could lose much of what they knew through death, distance, famine, conflict, or bad luck. Then bit by bit the conditions shifted. Food became more concentrated, populations grew, settlements held still for longer, memory escaped the body and entered marks, institutions learned how to store not just grain, but knowledge, authority, and expectation. Human life became denser, more layered, more cumulative. And once that had happened, history began to behave differently. It began, very slowly at first, to run. That phrase is useful, though we should handle it carefully. History did not wake up one morning and sprint off like an athlete who had finally stretched properly. It learned to run in the same way a river becomes dangerous, not because of one drop of water, but because enough channels have formed, enough pressure is built, and enough movement now reinforces more movement. That is what changed. For almost all of human existence, each generation had to fight hard just to avoid sliding backward. Later generations increasingly found themselves standing on thicker foundations. They inherited tools, techniques, words, myths, institutions, roads, records, crops, animals, measurements, customs, hierarchies, and systems of cooperation shaped by people long dead. The starting line kept moving forward, and once the starting line moves, everything feels different. A child born into a foraging band inherits a world of knowledge, of course, but much of it must be carried in living memory and renewed constantly through daily life. A child born into a literate urban civilization inherits not only living knowledge, but stored knowledge, organized knowledge, institutional knowledge. There are marks that outlast the speaker, rules that can be consulted, histories that can be retold from records, techniques embodied in workshops, skills preserved in specialist communities, beliefs embedded in temples, schools, courts, households, and public rituals. The individual mind is still doing what human minds always did, learning from others, imitating, questioning, remembering, improvising. But now it is learning inside systems built to retain far more than one lifetime can hold. This is the real beginning of acceleration. Not intelligence suddenly appearing, because intelligence was there long before. Not creativity arriving out of nowhere, because creativity is one of the oldest human habits. What changes is the durability of culture. Human beings become better and better at preserving what they learn, transmitting it across distance, and combining it with other preserved knowledge. Once that becomes reliable enough, progress stops being merely additive and starts becoming compounding. One invention helps produce another. One organizational improvement allows many technical improvements to spread. One scientific observation can be recorded, revisited, corrected, and turned into method. One society can borrow from another, adapt the borrowed thing, and send it onward again. The species becomes a machine for cumulative learning. You can feel this most clearly in the way later history seems to compress. Tens of thousands of years pass with change so gradual that from a modern distance it looks almost still. Then, over a few thousand years, cities rise, states form, writing spreads, empires connect regions, religions become text-bearing and transcontinental, trade routes carry goods and ideas across vast distances, technologies accumulate more reliably, and social systems become dense enough to produce both flourishing and oppression on entirely new scales. Then the pace increases again. Printing multiplies memory. Maritime expansion links continents. Scientific methods sharpen the ability to test and preserve claims. Financial systems concentrate resources. Fossil fuels unlock stored energy from deep time. Machines amplify labour. Industry transforms production. Communication outruns geography. Suddenly, the old, slow human clock seems to have been replaced by something feverish. And yet, even here, it is important not to tell the story as though speed itself were the invention. Speed is a symptom. The deeper invention is feedback. Once human societies become good at creating positive feedback loops, history begins to move in a new way. More food supports more people. More people support more specialists. More specialists create better tools, better administration, better transport, better communication. Better transport and communication widen trade and exchange. Wider exchange brings in new materials, new crops, new ideas, new techniques. Better record keeping stabilizes institutions. More stable institutions can support larger projects. Larger projects create still more surplus and coordination. The cycle reinforces itself. It does not always produce justice, wisdom, or beauty, but it produces motion. One of the reasons modern people find the deep past so hard to imagine is that we live inside several layers of these feedback loops at once. We inherit language that has been refined across millennia. We inherit writing systems, scientific habits, educational institutions, legal traditions, economic networks, roads, ports, electrical grids, agriculture shaped by generations of selection, and technologies made possible by thousands of previous improvements we did not personally contribute to. Even ordinary daily life is saturated with stored human effort. A cup, a road sign, a book, a battery, a calendar, a spoon, a door hinge, a loaf of bread. Almost everything around us carries the compressed intelligence of countless earlier lives. We are surrounded by accumulation so dense that we barely notice it. It feels natural. It is anything but. That density is why the later phases of history accelerate so dramatically. Once a culture reaches a certain threshold of stored complexity, new developments no longer have to be invented against a blank background. They can build on systems already in place. A mathematician does not begin with pebbles alone. A metalworker does not begin with raw curiosity and a lucky campfire. A navigator does not begin with stars and hope. A scientist does not begin by rediscovering measurement from scratch. Each begins somewhere already prepared by others. That is the essence of running history. The ground under each step has been laid by previous steps. Printing is one of the clearest examples of this. Writing had already allowed memory to escape the body, but manuscripts were slow, costly, and limited in circulation. Printing changed scale. Once text could be reproduced more quickly and more consistently, ideas became harder to contain and easier to compare. Knowledge that once sat in a monastery, court archive, or scholar's head could spread to many readers. Errors could be corrected more widely, arguments could travel, technical diagrams, maps, religious texts, political ideas, and scientific observations could circulate across regions and generations with greater speed and fidelity. This did not automatically make everyone wiser, as later centuries would demonstrate with considerable enthusiasm, but it dramatically strengthened cumulative culture. More minds could now work on the same inherited material. Then science, or more precisely the institutionalization of systematic inquiry, made another leap possible. Humans had always observed the world carefully. Hunters, gatherers, healers, sailors, builders, farmers and artisans all depended on precise observation. What changed in later scientific cultures was the development of methods and communities specifically organized around testing, recording, sharing, and correcting claims. This mattered because it made knowledge less dependent on isolated brilliance. A result could be described, another person could repeat it, a third could challenge it. Instruments could extend perception. Journals and correspondence could distribute findings. Knowledge became increasingly social in a new formal sense, not merely passed down, but actively accumulated through shared procedures. That is a crucial distinction. Earlier societies certainly accumulated knowledge, but later scientific institutions made the ratchet stronger. Once observations, experiments, and mathematical descriptions could be stored and debated across wide networks, understanding could move more rapidly and with less leakage. People still got things wrong, frequently and with confidence, which is another durable human tradition. But the system itself became better at correction. Over time, that meant faster improvement in fields where evidence and method could be shared effectively. The result was not only new theory, but new applications, better machines, better navigation, better medicine, better extraction, better communication, better destruction too, because every leap in knowledge arrives, carrying both promise and danger, like a parcel with suspiciously heavy contents. Energy is another part of why history learned to run so fast in recent centuries. For most of human history, power came from muscles, wood, water, wind, and a few carefully managed animal bodies. These sources mattered enormously, but they imposed limits. Work took time, transport took time, production took time. The scale of everything was constrained by how much organic energy a landscape and a society could gather. Fossil fuels changed that. Their ancient sunlight stored over geological time, and once humans learned how to extract and burn them at scale, the available energy budget of civilization changed violently. Machines could do more work. Factories could produce more goods. Transport could outrun wind and muscle. Cities could grow larger. Agriculture itself could later be transformed again through mechanization, fertilizers, and fossil fuel-intensive systems. The speed of history is, in part, the speed of energy conversion. This helps explain why the modern world can feel so unlike the early agricultural civilizations that first built cities and writing. Those societies accelerated history, certainly, but they were still largely living on annual sunlight, seasonal cycles, and the limits of organic labour. The industrial age broke through those limits with extraordinary force. A world that had long depended on what current landscapes could provide began burning the deep past to power the present. Coal, then oil, then gas, each gave civilization more motion, more production, more transport, more heat, more light, more machinery, more extraction, more waste, more reach. History, which had already learned to run, now found itself on a moving walkway. And then communication exploded. Oral speech had once carried culture across campfires. Writing carried it across generations. Printing carried it across literate populations. Telegraphy, telephony, radio, television, and digital networks compressed distance even further. Information could move faster than bodies. That changed not only trade and politics, but perception itself. Events happening far away could influence decision-making immediately. Markets, wars, scientific communities, governments, and public opinion became increasingly entangled across space. The human world became more integrated and more volatile at the same time. Acceleration was no longer only material, it became informational. A species that once lost ideas because groups were too scattered now lives in a world where ideas spread so quickly that the problem is often not scarcity but overload. At this point, the title of the larger story comes into sharper focus. For 250,000 years, humans did nothing. Then everything changed. But of course, that was never quite true. Humans were always doing things. They were surviving, adapting, inventing, teaching, remembering, forgetting, grieving, organizing, experimenting, and imagining. What changed was not human nature in any sudden miraculous sense. What changed was the capacity of human systems to preserve gains, connect minds, concentrate labour, and feed back on themselves. The first 250,000 years were not empty. They were the long build-up. The slow assembling of the mind, the group, the story, the tool, the fire circle, the memory system, the exchange network, the settled field, the granary, the mark on clay, the city wall, the road, the archive, the school, the workshop, the laboratory, the engine. The running begins late only because the groundwork took so long. That long groundwork also warns us against one of the easier mistakes modern people make, which is to assume that acceleration is the same as improvement in every sense. History running faster does not automatically mean life becoming better, kinder, or more meaningful. Faster history has built medicine, sanitation, libraries, electricity, and forms of comfort that earlier humans could scarcely imagine. It has also built bureaucratic states, industrial warfare, ecological destruction, mass inequality, surveillance, and the unnerving experience of receiving work messages at hours nature clearly did not intend. Acceleration magnifies human power, but magnified power carries everything in it: generosity, greed, curiosity, cruelty, imagination, waste. The species did not become morally new when history sped up. It simply became more capable. In that sense, the modern world is still recognizably ancient. We still gather around controlled light and tell stories. We still organize ourselves through shared myths, though ours often wear the respectable clothing of economics, nationhood, progress, security, or identity. We still depend on trust, memory, cooperation, reputation, and symbolic systems. We still worry about food, children, status, belonging, danger, fairness, death, and the future. The deep past is not gone. It is inside every modern institution, often hidden under layers of steel, code, and paperwork. The hunter-gatherer mind did not vanish when the first cities rose. It simply found itself navigating supermarkets, nation-states, and algorithms instead of migratory herds and seasonal camps. And perhaps that is the strangest and most beautiful part of the whole story. The same species that once struggled to keep a few fragile good ideas alive across small bands and dangerous landscapes now carries libraries in pockets, edits genes, measures distant galaxies, and reshapes the chemistry of an entire planet, which is both impressive and not a little alarming. The distance between those worlds can seem impossible, yet the bridge between them was built by countless ordinary human acts repeated across unimaginable time. A child learning from an elder, a better way of shaping a point, a story told accurately, a fire kept alive through the night, a field planted again, a mark made to remember grain, a road extended, a text copied, a question tested, a machine improved. Step by step, the species taught history how to keep moving. So the moment history learned to run was not really a moment at all. It was a threshold crossed gradually, then crossed again and again. First, when humans became good at sharing memory through language and story. Then when populations and networks made knowledge less fragile. Then when farming created surpluses, settlements, and denser social worlds. Then when writing stabilized memory outside the body. Then when cities concentrated people and skills. Then when printing multiplied knowledge. Then when science organized correction. Then when fossil fuels amplified labour. Then when communication compressed distance. Each layer made the next faster. Each gain made future gains easier to hold. The long stillness gave way not because earlier humans lacked brilliance, but because later systems finally learned how to preserve and multiply that brilliance instead of constantly losing it. And once you see the story that way, the old question changes one last time. It is no longer why humans did nothing for so long. They did an extraordinary amount. The better question is how long it took for human effort to become self-reinforcing. For one generation's survival, memory and invention to become a platform instead of a fragile inheritance. The answer is that it took almost all of our history. Most of the human story was spent building the conditions that made rapid change possible. The run came late because the species first had to learn how to stand, remember, cooperate, accumulate, and begin again without starting over. And perhaps that is a comforting thought in its own quiet way. We live in the rushing part of the story now, inside the acceleration our ancestors prepared without ever seeing it whole. But beneath all the speed, the deadlines, the networks, the noise, and the self-important machinery of the present, the same old human process is still there. People trying to keep useful things alive, people passing knowledge forward, people doing their best with partial understanding in a world larger than they can fully control. The pace has changed, the scale has changed, the stakes have changed. But the basic miracle remains strangely familiar. A clever, fragile, cooperative animal learned, very slowly, how not to lose everything it knew, and from that patient refusal to forget, the modern world began.